decade of payment or service to be eligible for relief. Houthi militants in Yemen fired missiles at an American-owned commercial vessel yesterday, the same day President Biden acknowledged that U.S. airstrikes have not halted those attacks. We get more with Bloomberg's news director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, Rosalind Matheson.
Basically, what you have from the U.S. is an acknowledgement of reality, and that is that despite a series of airstrikes from the U.S. and in some cases the U.K. on Houthi targets inside Yemen, they haven't really degraded the Houthis to the point that they're going to stop attacking or trying to attack ships in the Red Sea. And of course, the Houthis have been at this game for many, many years.
Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson reporting. And Congress has extended the deadline for a government spending bill, preventing a partial government shutdown this weekend. We learn more from Bloomberg's Nancy Lyons.
The Senate easily passed the measure that would fund some government agencies through March 1st and others through March 8th. Then the House took it up, and Republican Congressman Bob Good wanted more influence.
When you have the majority in one branch or one house of one branch, shouldn't you get half of what your policy priorities are?
Democratic Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro argued it was time to do their jobs.
Some of my colleagues would see that this government would shut down and don't care how hurtful that would be.
Nearly half of House Republicans voted against the extension, while all but 2 Democrats supported it. In Washington, Nancy Lyons, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 10:40 on Wall Street. I'm Nathan Hager, watching stocks rally on this Friday morning. We check markets all day long on Bloomberg. Right now, the S&P 500's up 14 points, or 0.3%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 0.2%, or 71 points. The Nasdaq 100 leading the gains, up 110 points, up 0.7%. Got a note from Bank of America this morning from Michael Hartnett saying the stocks that led the rally last year are traders' top picks once again. You can count tech among those. BNP Paribas Chief Market Strategist Daniel Morris says he sees reasons as well to be positive on this tech rally.
Certainly an earnings growth forecast for this quarter and for this year. They're high, but they don't seem outrageous. So even if you end up having some negative earnings revisions, you're still likely to have quite positive earnings growth. Valuations somewhat on the high side, but that's a function of the growth that we've just talked about. So it seems to be a pretty supportive environment, especially when you think at least between now and the end of the year, rates are going to be lower.
And once again, information technology is among the leaders in the industry groups in the S&P 500. 4 of the 11 main industry groups are in the green. Biggest decliner, consumer staples, among the 7 in the red. 10-year Treasuries down 7/32, yield 4.16%. NYMEX crude's up 0.7% at 74.56 per barrel. COMEX gold's up 0.25% at $2,026.70 an ounce. The euro little changed against the dollar, 1.0877, and the yen is at 148.32. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Bloomberg Markets continues with John Tucker and Bailey Lipschultz.
All right, thanks, Nate. Record close for the NASDAQ 100, and Bailey and I are just looking at the S&P 500 because the record close, what was it, 2 years ago, was 47.96.
Yeah, 96.56. So right now we're one.
You're doing
change.
Like going
decimals,
into hundreds.
Man. Well, that matters, when you're sending the hot headlines on the terminal. Okay. We got to keep the people
Wait,
in
I
the
think
know.
we're there. We're just going to do this all day long. Oh, it's up a point. So 47.96.27 on the S&P 500. Bubble or no bubble? That's kind of the question it raises for me. Brian Vendig is the president at MJP Advisors. He joins us now from, where are you, Connecticut?
Westbury, Connecticut, John.
Westbury, oh, lovely, to discuss the outlook for the market. So what say you when I say, oh my gosh, maybe a bubble?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true, John, when considering all parts of the market. I mean, when we look back at last year, we know that majority of the gains came from mega cap tech. And we did see a broadening out in the market in the fourth quarter. But really, when you look at areas like small cap stocks, some value-oriented sectors like healthcare and industrials, I really think there's some other parts of the market that, again, to the points that Bailey mentioned about, earnings growth, in 24, I think the market's going to come back to fundamentals, and we're looking at some earnings numbers over the balance of the year that can help those areas play a little bit of catch up, while at the same point in time, I still think there's that longer term trend with AI innovation that is going to play out in aspects of the technology sector.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, talking about the catch-up trade has been something I feel like has been top of mind since really the October bottom. Second best performer in the S&P 500 is NVIDIA, up 17%, obviously that coming after the TSM number. So when you look at that broadening, what areas are we going to see strength broadening out to, and what does that mean for the likes of an NVIDIA, which still seems to be red hot?
No, that's a great point, Bailey. I think on the NVIDIA side of the house, I'll just address that first. I mean, it's that expectation of growth moving forward. So when you look at the forward PE for NVIDIA, as much as the share price has had a nice run, the forward price to earnings ratio is actually quite reasonable, with a 20 handle or so. But when we talk about the other areas of the market, let's just be fair when we take a look at that disparity of return, going back to the S&P versus, let's say, the even weight S&P, for example. We know that a market cap S&P, 40%, is in those magnificent 7 names or so. And when we look at an even weight and we really strip that out, we see that the forward price to earnings ratio of the market is actually quite reasonable in some sectors under their historical average. So healthcare, small caps, mid cap stocks, looking at some areas in the industrial complex. I mean, these are things that we know that there's some breadth and some trends there, and the outlooks for growth are actually looking quite promising.
Okay, since you guys brought up AI, I got to ask, when does it start to gel in terms of the sales? Well, we've already seen that. You mentioned NVIDIA, but along with the productivity gains that are promised by this new technology. When does it all come together?
We like areas in technology that are focusing on workflow management, data management, thinking about how AI might create more productive outcomes when you think about cybersecurity, things of that nature than just saying, hey, we're going to invest in, a certain aspect of hardware that's probably going to be used because, AI is going to be coming. I think it's longer term trends. So will there be volatility in the space? Will there be the natural winners and losers kind of play out over the next 5 to 7 years? Yeah, we think so. But don't forget that, again, this is the point I'm trying to make, going back to Bailey's question, is don't forget about some of those other areas that have stable balance sheets, predictable cash flow, margins that look strong, and there's still innovation. And that's why I want to remind people about healthcare, because healthcare did not perform well last year, but it's one of those areas of the market where you're concerned about economic expansion this year, can be defensive, but we know there's a lot of innovation coming from healthcare companies as well that could be supportive for growth moving forward.
But where in healthcare do you particularly like? Are we talking biotech, med tech? That seems to be where innovation would be versus something like managed care?
Great point. I think to be selective in healthcare, we are looking at areas of some of the biotech, some of the big pharma space areas, because the big pharma companies, they're going out and acquiring other companies right now and building out their pipeline for new therapies and drugs. And I think as rates change, we might see a little bit more in that M&A space from healthcare. And I also think at the same point in time, we have a demographic shift that we know that is going to continue to play out in the United States. The baby boomers, they're not getting any younger. There's still demand for services and care that's out there. So even looking at some of the larger healthcare networks, healthcare providers, insurance providers, I know they've had a rough week this week when considering concerns around Medicare costs, but those that can execute and move through that, I think also are areas of healthcare that makes a lot of sense, Bailey.
Yeah, and I'm not a brown nose, but I got to point out the big boss's editorial today. The healthcare system, he writes, is more short-staffed than ever, even as it faces its next big shock, an aging population. So tackle that one from an investment perspective, since you brought up the healthcare industry.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's a concern around, let's say, investing in, let's say, hospitals that are trying to run their staffs at certain margins, but we have a labor shortage, and we also have issues in quality of care, which might suffer, which then causes demand shifts around that space. I'm focusing more on the ways to deliver the care and helping to support productivity, whether that might be software and technology in the healthcare space. Again, the insurance providers, helping to provide a wider network or better products or policies that people can take advantage of. So I'm not focused so much on the labor side. I'm looking more at the solution side to try to get through some of these problems, John.
All right, Brian, thanks a lot. We'll leave it there. President at MJP Advisors from lovely Westport. I think isn't that where Martha Stewart lives? Westport.
I'm not that demographic. I'm not going to.
You're from California.
Yeah, I'm a California kid.
All right. As we look at the markets right now, the update, S&P 500, 15 points higher, up 0.3%, 47.95, Bailey. Don't jinx it. Dow's up 97 points. That's up a 0.25% right now, 37,566. NASDAQ 100 also continues to add to its record close from yesterday, up 109 points, 17,091. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Markets. And time now for company news, and with that, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
John, Spirit Airlines says its deal with JetBlue Airways remains in full force and effect as the carrier explores ways to shore up its liquidity after a federal judge blocked the multi-billion-dollar buyout. The company also detailed efforts to refinance debt in a wide-ranging update. We get more with Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta.
So it looks like a lot to really reassure investors around just the idea that even in the absence of this JetBlue deal, which is kind of thrown cold water on, Spirit Airlines can still survive and do it with quite a bit of liquidity, and that's really being rewarded this morning in the stock market.
That's Kriti Gupta from Bloomberg reporting. Ford is cutting production of its F-150 Lightning electric pickup. The move will affect about 1,400 employees as the auto giant boosts production of Ford Bronco SUVs and Ranger pickups. David Lefkowitz is head of U.S. equity strategy at UBS Global Wealth Management.
I think it's pretty clear that there's been some slowdown in EV adoption. There's been some of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked by some of the OEMs, and we're getting into the part of the market where, it may take a little bit more effort to sort of penetrate the market. So, but I don't think this is a broader read on the health of the consumer.
That's David Lefkowitz of UBS Global Wealth Management on Bloomberg Surveillance. Home goods retailer Wayfair is cutting about 13% of its workforce. The Wall Street Journal reports the move comes after Wayfair's CEO sent a memo to employees urging them to work harder. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Radio.
And that brings us to 10:55 on Wall Street. It is time now for an update on news from around the world. Let's head back to the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington and to Amy Morris. Hi, Amy.
Hi, John. Nearly 60 deaths are being blamed now on severe winter weather. It is all across the country. Tennessee officials say 14 people died of weather-related causes during this latest blast of winter weather. More extreme cold is expected in the central U.S. through today into tomorrow. Forecasters warning of dangerous wind chills. And Congress has left snowy Washington. It's a snow globe out there, but not before passing another short-term spending bill to avert a partial government shutdown that would have started today. The measure will finance some federal agencies through March 1st and others through March 8th. House Speaker Mike Johnson was able to stop a last-minute effort by members of the House Freedom Caucus to sort of slow down that legislation. They wanted to tack on immigration policy demands. Some GOP hardliners are kind of angry that the speaker went back on his promise to not allow any more of these stopgap funding measures. President Biden says U.S. airstrikes against Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen will continue, even though they haven't halted the group's attacks on Red Sea shipping. Bloomberg government Zach Cohen has details from D.C.
The goal here is that the White House is hoping to deter future attacks, either by sort of stopping an imminent missile strike or at least getting the Houthis to step back from their strikes. But it seems at this point that they're going to keep up as long as Israel is attacking Gaza.
Bloomberg government Zach Cohen in the nation's capital. Now, here's something to think about before your head hits the pillow. Apologies in advance, but this story creeped me out. Sleeping with wet hair can lead to fungal infection and unhealthy hair.
Great.
Researchers in the UK say there can be up to 16 different types of fungi species in your pillow. They say it's better, wash your hair in the morning. But if you have to wash it before you go to bed, just make sure it's really well dried. And you may consider using a silk pillowcase to avoid any infections. I know. Global news 24
Or you
hours
could do
a day.
like Matt Miller and just shave it all off. Then you don't have that problem at all.
Well,
So
I could say something about that.
you better not.
No.
Do you have your snow shovel ready?
I was bald.
Did you know
4 years
Bailey
ago.
doesn't have a snow shovel?
What?
Amy? Yeah, it's crazy.
What?
He's from California, moves to
I'm
New
from
Jersey.
South Carolina, and I have a snow shovel.
I've been, in my defense, I've been a homeowner for all of 3 months.
That's not a defense.
That's no defense
You still have to get to your car.
Oh, my God. Amy,
God, love
in the
ya.
noon, Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in a snowing Washington. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Did you see this story on the terminal? It's one of the most read. It has to do with Todd Graves. I've never heard of him, and he's the founder of chicken finger chain. I've never heard of this either, but I live in a cave. Raising Cane's Restaurants.
Yeah. First and foremost, according to the internet, over 600 locations. I have friends who are big fans of Raising Cane's. There is one in New Jersey. There's going to be 7 in New Jersey. So maybe you'll be.
Okay.
Is Cherry Hill near where you live or no? That's the closest one to me.
You are so not from around here. No, that's way south.
I only know California geography loosely. But anyway, so Todd Graves, founder of Raising Cane's, buying a penthouse, a luxury condo in Dallas, the latest sign of the city's increasing shift to the ultra wealthy.
The other thing that catches my attention, he's now a billionaire from selling chicken fingers. Like, what are we doing wrong?
Yeah, net worth $7.2 billion.
Good Lord.
Which, if you got 25, so basically penthouse, 1-floor building where he will not need a snow shovel because I don't believe it has snowed in Dallas in who knows how long, was marketed for $25 million a few months ago. No official price was disclosed, but buying it in the 8-digit millions would be expensive, according to Bloomberg News, even by New York City standards. I don't know if you.
Well, if you go to Billionaires Row on 57th Street, it's just like the top floor of one of the new buildings. It's like mind-boggling.
The videos are cool.
$100 million or somewhere around there.
Anytime I see that in Manhattan, I'm kind of like, imagine if you took $12.5 million and bought a bunch of land somewhere way cooler with warmer weather.
You do that once you start selling chicken fingers.
When I have the ability to spend $12.5 million on a Manhattan luxury condo, I will be ready to rock.
All right, market reset, S&P 500, 47.98. Let's see if we can hold on to those gains. Up 17 points right now. That's a rise of 0.4%. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Markets. John Tucker, Bailey Lipschultz with you. More markets straight ahead.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
And more gains on Wall Street as we close out the week after a tech-led rally that pushed the NASDAQ 100 to a record. More gains for the NASDAQ 100 now. But should we worry about a bubble? Investors going to pay close attention to Federal Reserve speakers today for even more clues on the timing and extent of rate cuts. This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, and he has to be on his best behavior because he has a mortgage now. He's Bailey Lipschultz. We are in for Paul and Matt. Well, let's start things off with a market update and Bloomberg's Nathan Hager.
Well, John, you said it. We're in record territory for the S&P 500, have been for the NASDAQ 100, and the tech shares are leading the gains right now. Let's get right to those numbers. The S&P is up 15 points, or a third of 1%, 47.96. That's the record level. That's where we are right now. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 116 points, or 0.3% at 37,585. The NASDAQ 100 up 2/3 of 1%, up 109 points at 17,091. So tech's leading the way to close out this week. But LPL Chief Global Strategist Quincy Crosby is arguing for the tried and true barbell.
We have tech, we have semiconductors, we have consumer discretionary. But if you're scared stiff, you move over into the comfort zone. Now we have healthcare coming out. Healthcare looks like it's bottoming. You can have some consumer staples names in there as well.
Quincy Crosby of LBL joined us earlier on Bloomberg Surveillance. 10-year Treasuries down 5/30 seconds, yield 4.16%. The 2-year at 4.38. NYMEX crude's up 0.4% or 30 cents at $74.42 per barrel. COMEX gold's up about 0.5% or $9 at $2,030.60 per ounce. The euro, a little changed against the dollar, a little bit of strength at 1.0881. British pound weaker at 1.2677, and the yen, little changed at 148.12. Bitcoin's down a tick, trading just shy of 41,000. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Bloomberg Markets continues. Here's John Tucker and Bailey Lipschultz.
All right, Nathan Hager from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Thanks. A look under the hood now. Some of the stocks on the move, companies to watch. And Bloomberg equity reporter Norma Linda with us. Let's start off with, this is exciting, insurance.
It's the company that I have for insurance for my home.
Is it? Wow.
It all comes back.
So when people slip on your sidewalk because
Please
you don't have
you have something to cover it.
Everyone knock on the table. Hey, Travelers.
So you know all about this one. Travelers is up as much as 8% this morning, for its highest on record and its biggest gain since 2020. It's an insurance company that reported a core earnings per share for the fourth quarter that beat the highest analyst estimate by more than $1. Their personal insurance business is showing significantly improved profitability, and the outlook is for continued improvement. This company is based in New York City. Apparently, Bailey is very familiar with them, but it provides personal insurance for auto and homeowner policies, as well as company insurance for some more commercial needs like auto and property and workers' compensation coverage.
I give JT so many things to just bring back into this conversations. I love everything about it.
You're connected to it all.
Exactly. It all somehow ends up with a small dick. One other name, though, that we've been talking about, Spirit Air. I have never flown Spirit Air, though, so I just want to go ahead and say that, JT. I don't know if you're a budget airlines guy.
I just don't. I don't go anywhere.
But what's going on with Spirit?
I must admit, I've flown Spirit back in the college days when you're looking for a budget
Those are
option.
The yellow
one.
Yeah.
Yes. It's like a school bus.
You got to pay for everything. Yeah. I flew Budget Air in London, and they were selling lottery tickets. Do they do that on Spirit Air, too?
It seems like it's a cheap opportunity, but then you end up having to pay for luggage, and it adds right back up. Anyway,
you have to pay to use the ladies' room.
At this point, they might as well charge for that as well. Spirit. Spirit is up for its biggest gain since November 2020, up as much as 28%. We've been talking about this all morning. The stock is surging after reaffirming its support for the JetBlue deal, which we know is a bit of an interesting scenario. We've got Wall Street analysts saying that Spirit could be forced into bankruptcy, reorganization, or even liquidation. And the firm is really trying to defend itself. It's saying that, it hasn't really specified whether or not it will appeal the ruling that has happened by the judge, but it is defending itself, pushing back, saying that it is not pursuing nor involved in a statutory restructuring.
What's the next one? Because I don't know what this is.
Tricon Residential. That is in the real estate space, up as much as 29%, soaring for its best day on record and highest level in over a year. Blackstone announced that it's taking the real estate company private.
Oh, okay. This is part of Blackstone.
Yes, that's the headline news. The deal is worth $3.5 billion. The company is based in Toronto and owns single-family rental homes and apartments. So we've got residential REITs like Mid-America, Invitation Homes, and American Homes for Rent surging on the news.
Yeah, 38,000 rental homes in the U.S.
Where are they based?
Toronto.
Okay.
Yes, but they've got, as you mentioned, a good bit here in the U.S., 38,000.
Okay. Well, thanks. We appreciate that. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda with stocks to watch. And that brings us to 11:06.
Now on Bloomberg Markets, Munis in Focus with Joe Mysak.
And the focus on munis being brought to you by Build America Mutual, ensuring U.S. municipal bonds that finance essential American infrastructure and providing guaranteed income to improve any portfolio. Be part of Building America. Invest in, all right, everybody, BAM insured bonds. That was pretty long,
I don't have
actually.
that timber.
Yeah. Oh, well, you'll gain it back at some point. Let's talk about munis. Some municipality, I guess, is issuing debt for a mall in a swamp or an elevated monorail to nowhere. Let's enter the sometimes murky world of munis with Joe Mysak, editor of Bloomberg's Muni Markets Brief. What's new in Muni land? What are you looking at?
Tucker.
Remember the first time I met Joe, I had to debrief him on the radio, and you brought up, what was it, broiler mortalities. Do you remember that one?
Alabama. Yes, broiler mortality.
That was like dead chickens that were dying in, chicken facilities.
The chicken chill system, they called it. Anyway, what's happening?
Top that one.
Yeah, well, we haven't had a lot of high-yield deals so far this year. But we've seen a lot of deals, which is amazing because January is usually a very light issuance month. So we have issuance up. It's about, the last I checked, about $19 billion for the couple of weeks we've had so far this year. That's up almost 40% over last January, same period. So we've seen this kind of, I want to call it a surge in issuance. Very unusual.
What led to the surge? I mean, rate expectations? I mean, what?
It's funny. Issuers very rarely are rate sensitive, except during those times when they're refinancing deals, refunding deals. When they're just selling bonds for, whatever they're selling them for, streets, highways, broiler mortality mills. When they're just
Malls
doing
and
that,
swamps.
they are relatively rate insensitive. So they just come to market. But you brought up an interesting point. What's leading to this surge? I'll let you know. We had a very light December. Unusual again. It was about, it was a little over 20 billion, like 22 billion, I think it was, which is a very light December. Usually places are rushing deals. So you have a very light December, you have a pickup in January.
Joe, this is admittedly probably the dumbest question you've ever been asked.
Knowing
nothing about munis, do we typically see more activity in an election year? And how does the election impact activity?
That was pretty dumb.
That's what
I'm kidding.
Nice. Do we, know what we will see is more bonds on the ballot this year because it's a presidential election year. So you see more of everything. You have so many treasurers and governors and, presidential election years are big, in public finance, I guess you'd say. But are we going to see more sales this year? I think we will, but that's because last year we had a relatively light year. 2023, you're coming off a year that was down 20%. And, led a lot of banks to either cut back or get out of munis altogether. We had that story, Citigroup shut down their municipal bond department a couple of weeks ago. Last year, 2023 was relatively flat. It was up, a portion of 1%, but the previous year was down 20%. This year, we'll probably see, a nice increase. So I would say 400 billion, just because you had a relatively flat year, and it's kind of like a metronome, goes back and forth.
You were cracking the whip on a story that Bloomberg did on is it munis? College finance.
Huh.
Since they're all under pressure in terms of political correctness or whatever the latest controversy happens to be, being anti-Semitic was one of the charges. Schools like Harvard and the other Ivy League schools, they raise debt, raise money through issuing debt, right?
Lots.
How is this impacting them in the markets?
Okay, well, so far, as Eric Kazatsky pointed out, of Bloomberg Intelligence pointed out today, the elite schools, and I think there's something like $74 billion in this.
Why are they raising? They have so much money.
They're still
I don't get that.
Trading, like they usually do. They are very highly regarded because, like you say, they have tons of money. They have big endowments. They have tremendous demand. But yesterday we carried a story. We actually carried two stories. One based on, the Bloomberg Intelligence also. Joel Levington and Michael Dodo came out with an opinion piece saying, hey, you know what? The elite colleges better watch out because this kind of thing damages your reputation, and the rating agencies, it's time for them to wake up and maybe point out that these schools are facing some very contentious times. And, so far we haven't seen any reaction, but it is an issue. I have to admit, you take a look next time, probably not Harvard, but next time, a relatively elite college comes to market, you have to watch how the yields are.
Is there another event that you would say can be compared to this, whether it's individual universities having their own internal issues where there's been really a push against universities, how that could impact their debt?
I would say no, because this seems to me to be such a sui generis story, where you've had the political correctness, etc., roiling campuses.
Well, it's not just political correctness. I mean, it's just like, to be fair, it goes beyond
diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the anti-Semitism charges after the college presidents went to Capitol Hill. And of course, going to Capitol Hill is always a fraught experience for people. And, it's funny, you have college presidents going, and, you always have people on Wall Street. They love to go. It's such an honor to go. And yet it is a fraught experience. It can backfire.
You can get skewered.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
What, as an investor, what am I making in Muniland now? Am I like,
Well, interesting. We've seen yields.
As stocks surge.
We've seen yields creep up. And on the 10-year, you got about 2.5% tax exempt. But
is that callable?
The important thing, yes.
Okay.
Well,
they're all
it's
callable.
Usually the call is 10 years. So,
okay.
They're not going to come in with a 5-year call. What we've seen so far this year, though, and, for the few weeks we've had, returns are down. So the usual January effect we are not seeing. But the 3-month returns, and one of the reasons is we've seen more supply, but we also had very big returns. The 3-month return on munis is like 7.5%. So we're down a little bit. So the usual January effect hasn't gripped the market yet, and probably won't, because we're probably going to see a month with a lot of supply.
What's the weirdest issuance we've seen lately? Anything good? I mean, it's hard to top broiler mortality.
Yeah, broiler mortality or a nice, crumb rubber deal. Nah, nothing really stood out. Jefferson County sold a big refunding deal, and they, of course, went bankrupt a couple of
That's
years
Alabama?
ago. Yeah, Jefferson County, Alabama. So that was sort of an interesting deal, but they paid up, but it was more than $1 billion deal. But nothing. None of those nutty deals that I so love to write about, as you know, Tucker.
And Puerto Rico made it back from the brink. Illinois made it back from the brink, or give me an update there.
Well, I'll tell you something.
Where did they?
Well, you bring up Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico, they're kind of muddling along. But the rest of the 50 states, wow, they are awash in cash. They really, you look at it and say, well, surely they're worried about recession. No, not really. The states and most localities are doing really well. They have record rainy day funds, big reserves, and we have a story coming out a little later in the hour, I think. State and local payrolls are back to their pre-pandemic highs.
I'm looking at that Georgia Tech story, turning the municipal bond from $90 million athletic facility.
Isn't that the best?
I love that you just sell debt to make. I do not know what their libraries look like, but I've seen so many photos of comparing LSU's football facilities to where 99.9% of the student body spends their time, and it's night and day.
Yeah.
Oh, of course.
Stadium
the football stadium is gleaming. The
this
library
is cool. The rendering in the story is cool.
Yeah,
anyway.
They love, they love stadium finance. I'll tell you that. Although in Texas this year, believe it or not, or should I say last year, November, several big high school football stadium deals were turned down by voters, rejected.
Wow.
Which is unusual.
That's very unusual.
But I'm sure we'll see some more of those. Yeah, stadium deals.
All right, guess what?
No.
We're out of we are out. That seemed like a half an hour we were talking
Man,
here. Not that I don't like talking about munis, but Joe Lysak, editor of Bloomberg's Muni Brief. And as we update the markets right now, S&P 500 up 25 points. That's up 0.5%. So
JT, do they make 4,800 hats, or do we have to wait for 5K?
48.06. When do we send out like a red headline on that?
We're not on the intraday high yet.
Oh, the intraday high. Okay, but if we stay here, that will be a record close for the S&P 500. The Dow is up 178 points. The NASDAQ 100 adding to its record. It is up 155 points. This is Bloomberg Markets. And that brings us to 11:18 on Wall Street. Time for company news. And with that, here is Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
John, Macy's is laying off about 3.5% of its workforce ahead of the departure of CEO Jeff Gannett as the department store operator retrenches amid lower demand. More on that from Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti.
It's also closing 5 stores. Most of the cuts will be in corporate positions. Macy's has struggled to compete as shoppers shift away from department stores. But over at Walmart, that retailer is raising the average store manager's salary to $128,000 a year, up from $117,000, as it looks to attract and hold on to workers. The retailer said it's also redesigning its bonus program for managers so that store profits will play a larger role in figuring out annual bonuses.
That's Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti reporting. Spirit Airlines says its deal with JetBlue will go on as the carrier explores ways to shore up its liquidity. There are reports that the airline is urging JetBlue to appeal a judge's decision that denied their request to merge because of antitrust concerns. And it's finally here, the long-awaited headset from Apple. The mixed reality Virtual Pro headset is finally available for pre-order. $3,500 it's going to cost you, and it will also cost you a little bit of patience. That's because all 3 models, the orders will not be delivered until March 8th at the earliest. So, Bailey, you're going to have to wait a little longer for that hot tech
Who's
stuff.
buying these things?
Somebody with a lot of money and a lot of patience, as I said. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg. Stay tuned for more Bloomberg Markets coming right up.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Coming up to 11:22 on Wall Street, I'm Nathan Hager watching a Friday morning rally with the S&P 500 into record territory. We check the markets all day long on Bloomberg, and right now the S&P is up 23 points or 0.5% at 4804. That's above the record close of 47.96 set 2 years ago. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 179 points. That's a gain of 0.5%. The NASDAQ 100 is surging by 0.8%. That's up 145 points. Information technology is one of the biggest gainers in the S&P 500. 6 of the 11 main industry groups are in the green, led by communication services. The 10-year Treasury is down 5/32 at a yield of 4.16%. NYMEX crude's little change now at $74.01 per barrel. COMEX gold's up 0.3% at $2,027.50 per ounce. The euro little changed at 1.0884 against the dollar. The yen is at 148.21. Some of the biggest movers right now individually, Spirit Airlines up nearly 24%, saying its merger deal with JetBlue remains in full force despite a judge's ruling. And we're also watching iRobot. Those shares are tumbling. They're down more than 28%. That's after European Union said that it could block the $1.4 billion takeover by Amazon. That's according to reports, including from Bloomberg News. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Bloomberg Markets continues with John Tucker and Bailey Lipschultz.
All right, Nathan Hager, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Well, let's make a deal. What's the outlook for M&A in 2024, Bailey? Our next guest, Mitch Berlin. He's Vice Chair of America's Strategy and Transactions with Ernst & Young. And I got to say, I think he wins the prize for the coolest looking office on Zoom today. Are you like in a question? What are all the ribbons in the background?
They're actually dog show ribbons.
Oh, dog show! Oh, cool.
I'm even
now
more interested.
All right,
Yeah,
we've just changed. We've just changed the topic. So you're going to get in
My
trouble
dogs are
from
more
the company.
accomplished than I am, so
What kind of dogs?
On their behalf.
What are the dogs?
Portuguese water dogs.
Oh, beautiful. Those are the ones that are like hypoallergenic. They don't shed.
Right.
Now I
Oh,
need
that is awful.
Portuguese.
Anyway, okay, so we'll get back on topic. Is this an environment right now in 2024 that's conducive to deal making, and kind of what's driving it?
It will be. So 2023 was a reset to the pre-pandemic deal volume. So if you look at major deals, those are those deals that are above 100 million. There were approximately 1,250 in 2019 and 1,250 in 2023. So we were trying to understand, what does M&A look like going from there now that we've reset to pre-pandemic levels? And so we looked at the last 35 years of M&A, and we correlated that to information such as GDP growth, inflation, corporate profits, the bond spreads and such. And we did see a correlation. And so if the predictions for those same metrics hold true going forward for 2024, we should see about a 12 to 13 increase in M&A over the 2023 numbers.
Does the feeling, I spend most of my day job, Mitch, covering the IPO market, and the main sense is that something's got to give. Is that kind of your sense? We have a need for deals. We have cash on the sidelines. We have companies who are kind of nearing the end of their maturity in one sense or another?
That's exactly right. I think that we're at a point now where people have been sitting on the sidelines for 2 years. There are a lot of private companies or portfolios or private equity that are coming to maturity on their debt to refinance would put them in a very different position from an ROI than they are today. So they have to do the math and figure out, should we monetize now, or do we take the risk of refinancing, hoping that we can get a lower rate soon enough that it doesn't impact our ROI calculations?
Okay, so who's coming together in 2024? You don't have to name names, but like, well, that would be nice, but industries.
I can name the industry sectors. The sectors that we're going to see the most activity are the ones where the deal multiples have gone down, because in a time where you have a very high cost of capital and high multiples, it's unlikely that you're going to see a significant amount of M&A activity. But if you look at the sectors where the deal multiples have gone down, that includes life sciences and technology. Those deal multiples have gone down about 8 points each. And if you look at energy, those deal multiples have gone down about 4 points year over year. Those are the areas where
I thought energy was pretty much exhausted, like in 2023 with all those deals.
Well, there's still, it may not be the major players, but there's still players out there, and their cost of, the cost of capital is high, but the multiples are going down, so they can be attractive targets.
When you're talking life sciences, we saw a number of deals coming out of JP Morgan a few weeks ago. Is that biotech? Are we seeing smaller bolt-on deals? Are we going to see potentially the return of major M&A?
You're going to see both. I think when you look at major M&A, there's still patent cliffs looming, and they'll need to buy an R&D pipeline to continue to turn the profits that they want to turn. So I think you'll see it on both sides, and some of the smaller biotech deals as well.
What's up with the FTC and some of this antitrust, though? Is that something that's? It feels like every deal has some kind of a tie-up. Just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the new guidelines came out. It's been 13 years or so since they've come up with since they've revised the guidelines. The clients that we're speaking to understand that it's going to make things a little bit more difficult and take longer, but they're not shying away from deal making, because in many cases they really don't have a choice. And so more will come under the radar, because the threshold of what they consider to be a movement in the consolidation index has tightened. So more will come under the radar. They're going to require more information, so the timeline to get a deal done is going to take longer. So more is going to come under their scrutiny. But we are working with clients every day to come up with multiple scenarios that they can look at around reshifting the portfolio of the combined entity into something that would be more appealing to the FTC and DOJ.
Okay, you want to weigh in on Spirit? I mean, what happened there? It's maybe not specifically, maybe a broader view.
Well, my guess is that the way that they shifted the portfolio and the routes may have not been exactly what the FTC is looking for, but it sounds like they're going back to the drawing board. From what we're reading in the paper, it sounds like they're going to go back for another try at it. So I imagine they're going to have to reshift their portfolio into something that's more appealing.
Well, looking at iRobot, that's coming from Europe. Are they more stringent typically? Like, what's to read from one of the biggest technology companies not being able to buy the maker of a robotic vacuum?
Yeah, so I can't speak on behalf of the FTC, but or the European regulators on that one. I think the concern was around having a market dominance and being able to shut other players out, because the buyer of that has such a significant marketplace that they can control who's competing with their own products. And I think that there is some sensitivity around that.
Okay, so 2024 overall, you think is going to be a pretty hot year for M&A. Can we say that?
We do. We think again, 12 to 13% increase, which would be nice because over the last 2 years, M&A has gone down 30 to 40%, depending on what sector you're looking at.
And M&A is not just for the big guys. You can have much smaller, even businesses you've never heard of, right?
Right. And we would, and
I mean, how does that work? How is that different in terms of funding or whatever than the big deals?
Well, the smaller deals are easy to get funded, and sometimes you can fund them off balance sheet. But you probably will see a pickup in some of those smaller deals because, quite frankly, they're also coming up with maturities on their debt that they're trying to figure out how to refinance. And often, again, it's the cost of capital is too expensive for them now. They struck these deals 5 years ago when the cost of capital was almost free, and now they're paying 5-6%. That's a very different economic scenario for them.
Is that one of the bigger drivers behind some of these deals that we got a big debt coming up or whatever, and this is the way we can fund that?
That it will be for sure. They need to exit. They need to refinance that debt, and to increase that interest rate by 4 or 5% is significant.
What's up with private equity?
Small business. Yeah.
What's going on with private equity?
Private equity.
Do we call it private equity anymore, though?
PE?
Do we still call it that? Because it's kind of morphed into something else.
If we change the name, we'd have to change a lot of thought leadership. So we'll continue to call it private equity. But they're in a difficult position right now because, again, their deals are leveraged. They were, those that were struck 5 years ago, they were probably hoping to monetize by now, but they're coming up with the same maturity cliffs. And so they have to do the math to say, should we lower our valuations and try to sell these portcos now? Should we refinance, hope that we can get refinance for a lower cost of capital in a year or two and keep the valuations high? You have to go portco by portco and really do the math to see what makes sense, whether you move now or hold on it.
Okay, the question everybody's been waiting for: how many dogs and what are their names?
So I have 5 dogs.
Oh my gosh.
They are. So we got Loot, Tiki, Greta, Berta, and Irma. Yes.
All right.
So if you want a dog, I can ship one over to you right away because I have too many.
I will take any and all dog. I Googled. I didn't know what.
You don't even have a snow shovel yet.
The
You're
dog
already
can
getting a
stay
dog?
inside.
Good Lord. All right. We'll leave it there. Mitch Berland, Vice Chair of America's Strategy and Transactions with Ernst & Young. I don't think he's ever going to come back with us for that.
The real question is, would you rather have a dog or a shovel? I'd rather have a dog.
How about you get a dog that you train to shovel you out or something like that? Yeah, Bailey. S&P 500, 23 points higher. That's up 0.5%. 4804 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 155 points higher. That's up 0.4%. The NASDAQ 100 continuing to add to its record close yesterday, 144 points higher. That is up about 0.9%. 17,127 on the index. Let's do yields real quick. 2-year, which is more policy reactive, 4 basis points higher. That's at 4.39%. The 10-year, 1 basis point higher. That is at 4.15. And you are listening and watching to Bloomberg Markets. And let's get an update right now on news from around the world. And with that, the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom is where we find Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, John. Houthi militants in Yemen fired missiles at an American-owned commercial vessel yesterday. The same day, President Biden acknowledged that U.S. airstrikes just haven't stopped those Red Sea attacks. More on this with Bloomberg's news director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, Rosalind Matheson.
They won't be able to agree then on who's going to rule or manage Gaza in the aftermath of this conflict. Benjamin Netanyahu is now saying it can be a civil authority, but it has to be the one that he's comfortable with. And so there's a lot of obstacles in the way here to getting some kind of resolution to that conflict.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rejecting calls from the U.S. to scale back his military offensive in Gaza. Congress hoping the third time's the charm to resolve its differences on spending. Bloomberg government Zach Cohen tells us lawmakers have passed that third stopgap spending bill to avert a shutdown this weekend.
Now they have until early March to come up with new agreements. My understanding is Speaker Mike Johnson is now back involved in those talks. in order to negotiate new top lines for all 12 subcommittees that are in charge of writing these spending bills, but certainly another indication that funding the government continues to be a really difficult proposition for this Congress.
Bloomberg Government Congress reporter Zach Cohen in Washington. President Biden forgiving nearly $5 billion in additional student debt. The administration seeking to deliver on one of his signature initiatives. Almost 74,000 student loan borrowers will see their debt canceled. Japan's space agency says its spacecraft is on the moon, but they're still checking its status. The smart lander for investigating moon, or SLIM, came down onto the lunar surface earlier today, and if it is successful, Japan would be the 5th country to pull this off. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
$11:40 on Wall Street. I'm Nathan Hager on a risk on Friday with the S&P 500 flirting with record territory, low Treasury volatility, and some Fed-friendly data from the University of Michigan, adding to this idea that the Fed might be able to pull off a soft landing. Lots of debate in this market over whether they can do that. Ben Emmons, senior portfolio manager at New Edge Wealth, says he sees a strange landing. So how does he think investors should position?
You want to look at quality in terms of the consistency of earnings growth, because as much as you have multiples have expanded and the valuation becomes maybe again of a concern, if you get consistent EPS growth, then you have a quality company, meaning free cash flow, meaning the balance sheet doesn't deteriorate by any kind of credit changes, things like that. That's the core of our valuation framework.
And we check the markets all day long on Bloomberg. Right now, the S&P 500 is up 18 points or 0.4%, trading at 47.99. 47.96 is the record close set 2 years ago. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 130 points or about 0.4%. The NASDAQ 100 is higher by about 0.75%, a gain of 125 points. That index is already at a record. 10-year Treasury down 5/32, yield 4.16%. The 2 years at 4.40. NYMEX crude's down about 0.1% at $73.99 per barrel. COMEX gold up about 0.25% at $2,026.90 per ounce. The euro is showing a little bit of strength against the dollar at 1.0887. The British pound weaker at 1.2672. The yen, little changed against the dollar, 148.17. Bitcoin's down 1.75%, trading around 40,300. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash, and Bloomberg Markets continues. Here's John Tucker and Bailey Lipschultz.
All right, Nate, thanks a lot. Have a good weekend. The stock market ending the week, as you just heard there from Nathan Hager, on a positive note. Stocks that led the rally in 2023, they seem to be the traders' top picks again this year. Let's take a deeper dive into these risk assets. Skylar Wynand is CIO at Regan Capital. Let's start you off with the bubble question. Does this feel like a bubble to you?
It sure does, with stocks back to all-time highs, short end rates up 500 basis points in the last 2 years, long end rates up 250 basis points. You do the math on where stocks should be, given that rise in rates, stocks theoretically should be down upwards of 40% over the last 2 years.
Wow. So we're at it. You just took Bailey's breath away.
No. So what breaks then, Skylar? I'm just looking, we've got the swaps pricing in just under 6 rate cuts next year or this year. We've got a lot of analysts and strategists talking up 2024 earnings and looking into 2025. What happens?
You have to look at leverage first, and the most levered players out there are going to break first. We've already seen that in banks. Then it goes to private equity and very leveraged companies. The last folks to lose will be the least levered companies that are using a half a turn or maybe over only a turn of leverage. So I think the market's going to be really bifurcated. You hear a lot of folks talk about, let's stick to high quality. I like that. But look to leverage to break before anything else.
All right, 2 questions then off that, Skylar. Going back to your initial point, are you shorting the market, and then are you shorting some of these levered stocks? How are you playing that?
I think, we're not stock guys, but in my stock investments, I think, it's one of 2 things. A, sometimes the only way to win is not to play and to wait it out and maybe stick in mid to high single digit income plays. But B, own the entire market as well, where I don't know when the next NVIDIA or Tesla or Monster Beverage is going to come along. So I want to own them all.
Who's most over leveraged? Is that the right phraseology?
Definitely banks. Banks are government-sponsored hedge funds, so to speak, allowed up to 12x leverage. Now, what's happened over the last
You're talking the majors or regionals or what? Or just the entire industry?
All banks are allowed the same leverage. But regionals and community banks got a ton of cash in post-COVID, post-PPP, right? So folks got all this cash, they parked it at the banks. Banks sat there for 8 months. What are we going to do? Okay, let's go out and start buying treasuries and mortgage bonds. What's happened is
Which was a
lot of those
disaster.
bonds are down upwards of 20 points, right? And so if you were levering that up 10 times, 12 times, your effective equity now went from 10% down to about 4%. So you're upwards of 25x leveraged. So what you have to look at is you have to look at tangible book value, tangible equity, right? And if that percentage is at only 4 or 5%, divide 4 into 100, that's 25x. So you're 25x levered. So moves like we've seen since the start of the year, the bond market's down a point and a quarter. Multiply that times 20 for a regional bank or a community bank that owns treasuries and mortgage bonds.
So who's least leverage then on the opposite end of the spectrum?
JP Morgan, the big guys who had a lot of money, they took it in, they focused on fee-paying product like credit cards. They weren't immediately incentivized to go out and buy really, really long duration paper. And so on the flip side of the large guys, B of A, you'll see, has huge amounts of unrealized losses sitting on their balance sheet. JP Morgan looks like a genius because they didn't really go and invest in all of that money into, Fannie 2.5 coupon paying mortgages, which 2 years ago, the market thought everybody was going to refinance. And something like 70% of all mortgages have been issued in the last 2 years. So now the market thinks nobody's ever going to refinance again. Nobody's ever going to move. Everybody's stuck in these 2.5% coupon mortgages. So it's who owns that stuff and who doesn't. And JP Morgan stuck really short duration. And now they're coming out ahead of everybody. The time to own money markets and T-bills, honestly, was when rates were 0, not when rates are at 5.25, 5.5.
Well, Skylar, we've talked a lot about what you don't like. What do you like?
So now there's two sides of the coin in terms of equities and in terms of real estate and most things. It's, do you want to be the equity holder or the lender? Now is a great time to be a lender, okay? And you can be a lender on real estate. You can be a lender to equities, i.e. bonds. You can be a lender to municipalities. So now is as good of a time as ever to lend. The market's been hoping, savers have been waiting for 5+% yields on high quality fixed income for what, 16 years now? And it's here. We should be jumping into this like Scrooge McDuck.
Okay, I've always been told you don't fight the Fed, but certainly the bond market has been fighting the Fed, or so it would seem. Your impression, got about a minute left.
Yeah, the market, the Fed has been saying for the last 2 years now,
but we haven't been listening.
There's going to be a lot of pain, right? And we've seen pain. Bond market was down 13% last year, came back the last 2 months of, or I'm sorry, 2022, came back the last 2 months of 2023 to make it a positive year. And the Fed is still saying rates are only going to drop 2 to 3 times this year. Yet the market has priced in 6 drops this year and 8 drops over the next 18 months. So it's a really good time to sit in floating rate paper that'll hugely benefit from the Fed, what's the Fed saying happening versus what the market is saying. If you're in fixed rate paper right now, what you're long is rates dropping 7, 8, 9 times over the next 18 months.
All right, we'll leave it there. Skylar Winans, the CIO at Regan Capital. Words of warning.
Yeah.
You were like taking a
I was caught off guard by it, to say the least.
You were also caught off guard by the snowstorm. S&P 500, so I'm not going to let that down. Up 17 points, a rise of 0.4%, 47.98 on the index. The Dow is up 110 points. The NASDAQ 100, 126 points higher. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Markets. That brings us to 11:50 on Wall Street, and time to get to company news now with Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
John, shares of Spirit Airlines have soared after the carrier announced it's not giving up on the proposed merger with JetBlue. More from Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger.
Steve, Spirit is trying to persuade JetBlue to appeal the government's decision to block the merger of the two carriers. Spirit indicates in a regulatory filing that it still believes in its plan to merge with JetBlue, saying it continues to believe a combination is the best opportunity to increase much-needed competition and choice. In the meantime, Spirit says it is taking steps to ensure the strength of its finances and ongoing operations in case it has to continue on its own. Steve?
Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger. Let's talk about Apple, something, though, that has nothing to do with that headset. The tech giant is making an offer to appease antitrust regulators in Europe. More on that from Bloomberg's Sam Stolten.
Apple, the European Commission, announced today is seeking to potentially sidestep a hefty EU antitrust fine by filing commitments in an ongoing abuse of dominance case here in Brussels. Now, this case involves Apple's near-field communications chip. And what the European Commission says is that Apple actually restricts access to this chip to other rival mobile wallets.
Bloomberg's Sam Stolten reporting. Imagine being sued for being late. Two fans of Madonna are suing her, New York City's Barclays Center, and concert promoter Live Nation. They say she took the set 2 hours late at a recent show. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Radio.
And that brings us to 11:55 Wall Street. Let's get an update. News from around the world. We head to Washington, the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom, and Amy Morris. Hi, Amy.
Hi, John. We are watching the weather. Forecasters say that second storm is going to sock New York with snow after causing chaos farther south. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn.
A weak storm system off the Delmarva will bring a light snowfall to much of the northern mid-Atlantic states and on into extreme portions of southern New England today. A 1 to 3 inch snowfall is possible generally from Baltimore on towards Trenton, New Jersey. There'll be some areas in southern Pennsylvania and also across central New Jersey that may see as much as 2 to 4 inches. For the major cities, it's a couple of inches around New York and also in the Baltimore and Washington areas. Boston will see less than an inch. Looks like some of the towns south of Boston, though, could see as much as 1 to 3 inches.
Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Meanwhile, Congress has left snowy Washington. Yep, we're getting the snow, but not before passing another short-term spending bill, averting a partial government shutdown that would have started tonight. Bloomberg government Zach Cohen has more from the nation's capital.
This has actually been the third continuing resolution or stopgap spending bill they've had to pass so far this current fiscal year. And so it's clearly an indication that lawmakers are having trouble coming up with any sort of agreement to fund the government for this current fiscal year.
Bloomberg government Zach Cohen reports this resets the clock now to March 1st for lawmakers to resolve their differences on full-year spending. Thousands of anti-abortion activists are in D.C. today. They don't care about the snow. They're here for the 2024 March for Life. It is the group's second march since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. The demonstrators are gathering on the National Mall now for a rally that's set to begin at noon local time. That's just 3 minutes from now. Then they'll march to the Supreme Court building. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg John and Bailey.
All right, thanks, Aim. And this is Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Bailey Lipschultz. We're in for Matt and Paul. And one of the stories getting a lot of attention on the Bloomberg today happens to deal with a short. What is it, the best short call of 2023?
Not made by a hedge
Shorts,
fund.
for those that don't know, it's just when you bet against something, basically.
You
right?
make money when the stock goes down.
Yeah, okay.
Really. So wasn't one of those activist firms, wasn't Hindenburg, which we've spent so much time talking about.
This is somebody you probably never heard of.
This is a first-year medical resident named James Block, no relation to activist short seller Carson Block, running a blog named after the SpongeBob SquarePants character Dirty Bubble. He targeted.
Which one is Dirty Bubble? Because
I hope that we're supposed to have a graphic if you're
no,
watching
it's
or
just you.
streaming on
You're
YouTube.
not Dirty Bubble.
As far as I know.
No, we'll probably get sued if we bring up Dirty Bubble.
Dirty Bubble was a villain in SpongeBob, one of the many villains. Big fan of SpongeBob. But so 20,000 subscribers.
You should be concentrating on taking care of your house instead of watching cartoons, but that's just me. Please continue.
And smoking meat. What else are we going to do? So Dirty Bubble, one of the antagonists in SpongeBob. This short seller underneath the name Dirty Bubble, targeting Signature Bank, basically saying he furthered his investigations into the crypto world, basically developed a hobby between shifts, according to this terrific Bloomberg story, debunking the crypto ties to Signature Bank, which we know collapsed 2 months later. So in terms of
okay,
upside,
so it wasn't basically why Signature collapsed, their association with crypto. He just saw their investments or their associations with some of the crypto players as being kind of sloppy, so it reflected the overall sloppy nature of the bank's investments, I guess.
Yeah, reading from the story, this is a quote from him. He said he saw just how careless they were being with who they were doing business with the amount of money they were holding, and the amount of uninsured deposits they had. From his home office near Ann Arbor, Michigan. Shout out to University
Do we know
of Michigan.
how much he finally made from all this? I don't see
it in the story.
But anyway, it's when you brought it up, you said a doctor shorting, and my first thought was Michael Burry, because remember from The Big Short, he's a medical doctor, I think from Vanderbilt University Medical School.
Went to
so anyway,
Vandy.
kind
Smart
of
guy.
interesting. These are smart people. S&P 500, I bet they also have snow shovels, up 23 points, up 0.5%, 4804 on the index. Let's see if we can hold on to that. The Dow up 133 points, the NASDAQ up 155 points. This is Bloomberg Markets.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, stocks head higher. The Nasdaq 100 crosses into a new record again. The S&P 500 on track to close at a record. And still the question remains, have markets overpriced the speed and depth of Fed rate cuts? This is Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Bailey Lipschultz, and we're for Paul and Matt. Let's start with a check of the markets, and doing that for us now, Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini. Hi, Denise.
Hey there, John. Well, it is 12:01 on Wall Street, and we do check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. A lot of green, as you mentioned, on the screen this Friday trading session. Strong consumer sentiment, a big theme today. U.S. sentiment this month hitting the highest since 2021, exceeding expectations. And we also had those comments from Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago President Austin Goolsbee. He said a continuing decline in inflation would mean talking about cutting interest rates is warranted. But Tony Crescenzi, market strategist, portfolio manager, and member of the firm's investment committee at PIMCO, says the Fed hasn't achieved price stability yet, guys. And he says the Fed might not cut rates as soon as you think.
Part of this soft landing, or strange landing, how you want to call it, is that the economy is not going to recession. The spending levels remain so high, and it's invested in the economy.
Yeah, and that actually was Ben Emmons of New Edge, but he's saying something similar. Crescenzi also said that the Fed might not raise rates at all this year. The Dow right now, it is higher by 133 points. That's up about 0.4%. The S&P 500 up 0.5%, better by 23 points. The Nasdaq up 0.7%. That record up about 99 points right now. Spot gold right now, it is higher just fractionally, and NYMEX crude, it is lower by about 0.9%. Macy's laying off about 3.5% of its workforce, more than 2,300 people. That's amid lower demand. Macy's shares down by about 3%. Online home furnishings company Wayfair, though, it's cutting about 13% of its workforce, but investors like that, even though it's more than 1,600 employees. That stock is up about 12%, guys. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini. Thanks, Denise, for that. Appreciate it. And right now it's time to look under the hood. Some of the stocks, the individual stocks and companies on the move. And for that, Bloomberg equity reporter Nora Melinda. Let's start off with, I see their trucks on the turnpike when I'm going home. J.B. Hunt. They were actually in the news yesterday as well.
Yes. Looking at J.B. Hunt, it's paring some of its gains, but was up as much as 3.8% earlier in trading for its biggest gain since November. The trucking company reported a fourth quarter operating revenue that beat consensus expectations, propelled higher by strength in its intermodal business. For those that don't know, intermodal is essentially moving freight by two or more modes of transportation.
That's like you put the container on the back of your truck.
Yes.
It can either go on a ship, it can go on the rails.
Exactly,
go on
very
the truck.
versatile. So seeing strength there, city analysts.
Do they ship snowblowers and shovels? I don't know.
That's what we need to know.
They do. They have plenty of supplies.
Analysts have raised 2024 estimates modestly, given better yields and margins.
Another stock, we talked about Ford.
Yes.
Now we have Stellantis' CEO saying that EV price cuts are going to result in a bloodbath. Now I need more details.
He said bloodbath. Yeah. I had to pick this one out.
Bloodbath for who?
He says that he doesn't plan to slash electric vehicle prices just to win market share. It's so interesting, especially as we're talking about Ford today and how it's been cutting its production of its F-150 EV pickup truck. But the CEO of Stellantis is saying, if you just go and cut pricing, disregarding the reality of your cost situation, it's a race to the bottom.
Okay. Our last guest was talking about bloodbath in the markets. Don't worry, you could always clean it up with your iRobot. What's going on with iRobot and Amazon, right?
Yes. So iRobot.
Those pesky European regulators jumping in?
They are jumping in. So essentially, iRobot shares are tumbling as much as 33%, plunging for their worst day since 2012 and lowest level since 2010. This is all on expectations that the EU antitrust regulators will block Amazon's proposed $1.4 billion deal to acquire the company. And as we all know, they're the maker of the Roomba, if you guys have one of your own. But my question is, what other robot vacuum makers are there that are competitors? Because I only know of the Roomba.
I think that's probably the thing. I mean, we were talking about Google Nest. We were talking about
wait.
Ring.
Why don't they come up with an iRobot that will shovel your driveway?
Now that would be nice.
man, it
We
always
could send one
comes back
straight
to
to
it.
Bailey.
Automated snowblowers. I'm just saying, I would probably not buy one.
Well,
I
they
haven't bought
also
a shovel yet,
don't they
so.
make the automated electric lawnmowers too?
I don't have one. I have a small yard. I do have a lawnmower though. Won't do me much
That's
well.
good.
Nice.
You can try that on the snow.
But where's the competition? I'm curious. But I mean, the shares are plunging nonetheless.
The thing that stood out to me, it's trading at its lowest level since 2012. The deal was announced in 2022. So I know we spoke about this at the desk. Is this come back to a debt question, the path forward for the company? Like, is that something that kind of is top of mind, similar to what we saw with Spirit?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these things are in focus. They did say that the final decision still needs to be formalized. That approval may not even come until
Wait,
February
what was their
14th.
main objection? That it's going to be bad for consumer? What is?
I mean, the main objection is that it's just too much competition. So if Amazon was to take on this deal with iRobot, that it would essentially harm other robot vacuum makers.
So if we were starting up an iRobot,
None of whom we can name.
My point exactly.
Well, I was the question I posed to one of my colleagues on this was: is this drawing a line in the sand? Because if Amazon can buy iRobot for $1.4 billion, what else could they buy? But I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a specialist.
So we're going to close at a record today for the S&P 500. Why don't you jinx us, Nora?
Let me not jinx you all, but hopefully we will reach that record and close there. I mean, we already reached it earlier. Let's see if everything shakes out that way this afternoon.
What else are you looking at? Just the broader market perspective from you.
I'm always looking at real estate, as you all know. So this morning we did have some data come out. Existing home sales slipped last month. We
call them used home sales.
Yes, I like that. Used. But it is really interesting, especially as we look at how a lot of these new homes have been taking market share from existing homes. And so we are in this weird locked dynamic where nobody wants to move out of their current home to provide homes for people who are looking for homes.
Are you ready to refinance at this point?
No, I'm not quite there. I look at WRP pretty much every day to see when I will be able to.
And it's constantly changing.
It is not trending in my favor. Before I was like, we'll lock it in January. Now it's kind of like, we'll lock it in.
You got to push it out a little bit longer.
Well, 3 1/4 here, and no, I'm not going to ever sell. Like, I don't care. But anyway, that's my perspective. Bloomberg Equity Reporter Nora Melinda, thanks very much for stopping by. I appreciate it. Well, let's get a market reset. S&P 500, 22 points higher. That is up about 0.5% right now, 4803 on the index. And of course, if we maintain this, it will be a record close from, what was it, 2 years ago?
Record close from 2 years ago. We'll bust out the 4,800 hats. JT, we were talking about this earlier. You mentioned that the winners from last year are rallying. NVIDIA, Apple, Google, Meta, 4 of the 5 biggest drivers today. So even if you've been bashing big tech valuations, it seems like investors can't stay away from it.
And the Russell 2000, which was more appropriately priced, I would say, in terms of earnings, that is down right now, down 0.4%, 1915 for the smaller cap stocks. The Dow up 130 points. That's a rise of 0.4%. The NASDAQ 100, the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100, continues to add to its gains. 146 points higher. That is up 0.9%. It's 17,128 on the index. Let's move on to our next guest and our next topic. One of the stories today that caught our attention, Ford reducing production of the F-150 Lightning. Let's find out more. Bloomberg Intelligence automobiles and industrials analyst Steve Mann is joining us to discuss what is so hard about first of all, making an electric vehicle, making it priced to sell, selling it, and, you know, me buying it. It's just, they should know how to do this because Ford's been in business for over 100 years making cars. Can you pick up on that?
That's absolutely true, but you know, making EV is a whole different ball game, and the highest cost on an EV is actually the battery. So the battery is actually driving the cost up for a lot of automakers. You know, Tesla has done a better job at managing that by sourcing it from China, but George, the legacy automakers like Ford and GM, it's going to take a little bit of a while. They're building new plants to cut back on the cost, but you know, battery is the main issue.
And when you look at the margins, profit margins for Tesla, 20%, double that for Ford. So is that just because Tesla has figured everything out and they are still, to not avoid a pun, in the driver's seat?
Yeah, well, 20% for Tesla. Ford, if you listen to the third quarter, they were actually losing a lot of money. They were like, EBIT margins was like negative 75%. It was a little bit better at the beginning of 2023, but, you know, Tesla started a price war, and that's kind of, you know, squeezing a lot of the legacy automakers. You know, like I said earlier, you know, Tesla, you know, they started off as an EV company. But for Ford and GM, you know, Ford with the F-150 Lightning, what we call those vehicles are the Generation 1 EVs. So basically what they've done was convert their existing fuel ICE vehicles, petrol vehicles, into EVs. So it's not the best way to do it because you're really adding cost to it instead of starting from scratch where you design in you know, the batteries and other, you know, motors and other components, and you can actually cut costs when you start doing it from scratch.
Steve, how much of this is really the fact that truck buyers don't want an EV? I'm just looking at the story that they're going to increase production of the Bronco and the Bronco Raptor in the Ranger and Ranger pickup trucks. What's the driver?
If you're a pickup guy, like, is EV like not cool or not macho enough or what?
Well, I think right now EVs are not very much of a utilitarian vehicle. The other thing is affordability. You know, we're seeing across the board in the auto industry affordability becoming an issue with interest rate going up, but you know, EVs more so because on average EV prices are probably 20-30% higher than an ICE vehicle. Even with the price cuts in the last 12 months. So, you know, you know, for EV to be competitive with ICE vehicle, it needs to come down a lot. It needs to come down below the average price of a gasoline vehicle. I mean, and again, that's going to take a few years to get there.
I think I trying to get a sense of whether or not they're throwing in the towel on EVs, at least when it comes to pickup trucks at this point, and what's going to be the key for the future?
Well, I think the ship has sailed for EVs. I think it's here to stay. What I really think, and this is more of a U.S. issue, is we're going to have to take a pause here because, like I said earlier, battery is the highest cost, and that supply chain in the U.S. is pretty much non-existent. It's dominated by China. That's why they can do it really cheaply, and that's why, you know, Tesla can sell their cars cheaply because they're buying it from China. So, you know, GM has already came out and said, you know, we're pretty much sourcing everything that's non-Chinese because the IRA stipulates, the Inflation Reduction Act stipulates that, you know, for it to get federal tax credit, you have to source non-Chinese components. So it's going to take 2-3 years for that supply chain in the U.S. to build up and battery production to be locally located here in the U.S. So costs will come down. And I think between now and then, between now and 2026, 2027, I think affordability will still become an issue, and that's going to have some headwinds on EV sales.
I don't want to get too far afield, but I thought I had seen a story that they had hit a big mine somewhere in northern Nevada, the ultimate kind of lithium mud or whatever it's called. Yeah. Are we less reliant on China?
We are not less reliant on China, but I think the Inflation Reduction Act is actually generating a lot of investments throughout the value chain. You know, lithium mining, like you said, in Nevada, they're working closely with countries like China, Australia, parts of South America to actually source a lot of the lithium, source a lot of the graphite that's also dominated by China. And, you know, those mines will have to take time to come online. And in the meantime, you know, there's a lot of investment, billions of investments in the U.S., and a lot of these new battery plants that this lithium is going to feed into will actually will start production, you know, as early as 2025, but mostly in 2026 and 7.
Steve, we've got the Stellantis CEO saying that a race to the bottom in terms of EV price cuts will cause a bloodbath, basically digging his heels in, saying they're not gonna do that for their Jeep and Dodge products. Do you think we'll see other automakers do that, or is he just kind of talking a big game?
I think it needs to stop at some point. I mean, we've seen these price wars before, not in the EV segment, but in another segment. Nobody's going to win at the end of the day. This needs to stop. You know, and you know, I think Tesla is guilty of that. So is BYD out in China, if you look at the global market. So I think he's right. I think at some point, you know, like I said earlier, the ship has sails on EV. Everybody's going to have to sell them at some point, you know, due to regulations here and abroad. And at some point, they're going to have to stop cutting prices. And I think we're closer to that than we were probably 6 months ago. We already saw 20 to 25% price cuts across the board in the industry here in the U.S. There's not much room to go, really.
Steve, we've got about 45 seconds left. Next week, Tesla earnings on Wednesday. What are you looking for, and what can we expect to hear from the company that'll have a read across to the space?
Yeah, I think earnings will we'll continue to see what we saw in the first 3 quarters. Pricing will still have an impact on earnings. I think more importantly is the guidance that the company's going to give in terms of sales. I don't think you know, we're going to see the high double digits that we saw in the last few years. You know, last year, 2023, they sold 1.8 million. We're probably looking around 2.1 million in 2024. So, and you know, that's on the back of price cut in 2023, but there could be more to come.
Okay. Steve, thanks a lot. Bloomberg Intelligence Automobiles and Industrials analyst Steve Mann joining us there with the look at Ford reducing production of the F-150 Lightning. S&P 500, 22 points higher. That's up about 0.5%, 4803 on the index. You're listening to and watching Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Bailey Lipschultz. That brings us to 1218 on Wall Street. And let's get company news now. And for that, here's Steve Rappaport.
John, Spirit Airlines says its deal with JetBlue Airways remains in full force and effect as the carrier explores ways to shore up its liquidity, offering investors a measure of relief after a federal judge blocked the multi-billion-dollar buyout. The company also detailed efforts to refinance debt in a wide-ranging update. We get more on that from Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta.
So it looks like a lot to really reassure investors around just the idea that even in the absence of this JetBlue deal, which is kind of throwing cold water on, Spirit Airlines can still survive and do it with quite a bit of liquidity, and that's really being rewarded this morning in the stock market.
That's Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta reporting shares of Spirit Air currently up more than 20%. One of Detroit's big 3 is making changes as demand for electric vehicles slows down. Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams has more.
Ford just announced it's cutting production of the F-150 Lightning electric truck. The automaker says it will transition its electric vehicle center to a single shift starting April 1st. Ford says about 1,400 employees will be impacted.
That's Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams. The company said it expects continued growth in global EV sales in 2024, though it will be less than anticipated. And shares of Wayfair are up after the home goods retailer announced it's cutting more than 1,600 employees, roughly 13% of its global workforce. Wayfair expects the restructuring to save the company more than $280 million a year. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg. Stay tuned for more Bloomberg Markets on the radio and on the web. That's coming up right after this. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It is 12:21 on Wall Street. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are surging today. We have stronger than expected consumer sentiment and waning inflation fears. That's the big assist today. But Ben Emmons, head of fixed income at New Edge Wealth, says you shouldn't be too worried about the economy, even if the Fed keeps rates higher for longer, because he's pretty sure the economy won't crash. Here's why.
Part of this soft landing, or strange landing, how you want to call it, is that the economy is not going to recession. The spending levels remain so high and it's invested in the economy.
And Emmons there on the Bloomberg Markets podcast. The Dow right now, it is up about 0.4%, better by 150 points. The S&P 500 better by 0.5%, 28 points higher. And the NASDAQ surging 0.7%, better by more than 102 points. We did hit that new record high for the NASDAQ. We'll see if we can hold on to that gain. The yield on the 10-year right now, it is slipping. We have 4.16% right now. Spot gold, fractionally higher, and NYMEX crude, it's been lower all day. Right now, NYMEX crude looks like it's down about 0.9%, 78.47 a barrel. Comerica says net income will probably slide 11% this year. That stock's down about 0.5%. It's talking about a plunge in fourth quarter profit on a series of one-time charges. And Spirit Airlines says its deal with JetBlue remains in full force as the carrier explores ways to shore up its liquidity, offering investors what you might call a measure of relief after that court decision blocked the multi-billion-dollar buyout. That's the Spirit, and Spirit shares right now, they are higher. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Denise Pellegrini, thanks very much. You're listening to Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Bailey Lipschultz. We are in for Matt and Paul. On to our next subject. Looks like they achieved something in Congress, Bailey, at least for the time being. Bloomberg News congressional reporter Laura Davison is covering the kicking of the can down at the road. What's the next milestone I have to worry about?
Well, so the first week in March is going to be the next set of deadlines. March 1st and March 8th is when this current round of government funding expires. You know, we're now, this is a very common thing for Congress to do. They get up to a deadline, realize they can't get a deal in a couple days, and just push the deadline down 6 or 8 weeks down the calendar. This is really because, I mean, a couple reasons. You have, conservative Republicans who basically can't agree with others in their own party about what spending level should be. Plus, there's other things, other priorities, other spending things that aren't in that main bill funding the government, but that other lawmakers want to get done. These are things like a border security deal that has Ukraine aid in it, also a tax deal that some lawmakers stayed back in Washington today to try to advance that. So over the next couple of weeks, the two things that Congress is going to be focused on are this, border security Ukraine deal, as well as tax policy. We'll see if they can get any of that done. What we've seen in Congress recently is that really they only can do what has to be done without some grave consequences. Stuff that is kind of nice to have usually gets left by the wayside.
Laura, are there any winners or losers from this agreement and kind of what's on the horizon?
Yeah, so right now, Mike Johnson is a winner. He still has his job. He is subject to the same rules that former Speaker Kevin McCarthy was subject to. This is not clear how long he will continue to have the support of his party. Excuse me. Remember, all it takes is one Republican to say, hey, I want to vote of no confidence in this guy. And because of the very slim margins Republicans have, it just takes 2 or 3 people to join with Democrats to vote him out.
But
So for now,
didn't Mike Johnson have to make a Faustian bargain, or with, maybe that's a little too extreme, with Democrats? And what happened there? He was actually talking to Democrats at one point, wasn't he?
Yeah, so Republicans and what they call the Big Four. So this is the Republican and Democratic leader in both the House and Senate met with Biden earlier this week to talk about this border security deal. And they, had expressed some cautious optimism earlier in the week that they might be able to get towards a deal. Then, not even just a couple hours later, Donald Trump came out and said, look, Republicans hold strong, don't agree to a deal unless Republicans are getting absolutely everything that we want. And of course, in a divided government where you have a Democrat in the White House, a Republican House, and a Democratic Senate, nobody is going to get exactly what they want. So the likeliest scenario, if Republicans hold true to what Trump wants them to do, is that nothing will happen.
Is it surprising at all that Donald Trump still has so much power and control over kind of the path of not only Republican politics, but U.S. politics as a whole?
It definitely, if you had asked this question a year ago, it would have been surprising. The Republicans were just coming off doing worse than expected in the midterm elections. But now, a year later, you have Donald Trump, who looks like he's going to be the likely presidential nominee for the Republican Party.
But they kind of ignored him with this negotiation, right?
Well, not really. They sort of ignored him, and then he kind of came out strong and said something. And now you kind of see everybody, scurrying around trying to figure what that means. The Republicans that you have that are pushing the most for this deal are folks like Mitch McConnell, who don't really care about Donald Trump, don't have a good relationship. But where the issues are going to be in the House, where you have a lot more support for Trump, and the margins are just much more unfavorable to getting a deal done.
Okay, you had mentioned a couple of issues, border and I think Ukraine funding. How do they play into this, if at all, and what's the future of those two issues in this Congress?
Yeah, so the reason that these two issues got paired is because Republicans were very anti doing something on Ukraine. This is something more that Democrats are wanting. But they kind of came to this deal of, okay, look, we really care about, our southern border. We want to do something. Republicans said that, and Democrats like, look, we need to continue to support our ally in Ukraine, and they're running out of money. They're in the middle of winter, and they're going to need more support from us. So this came up over, months and months of posturing. They finally said, okay, this is going to be the deal that we want to pursue. But this is really tough stuff. Both sides generally agree they want this deal to come together, but it's when you start talking about what are the bullet points, what are the actual spending levels, what are going to be in there, that's when you get both kind of the far extremes of each party, progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans getting very nervous and very willing to walk away from a deal.
Laura, I just want to step back briefly. We've got about 6 weeks of funding, and I believe 3 of those weeks the House is scheduled to be on break. So what actually can and could actually feasibly get done over the next 6 weeks before, as JT put it, the can gets kicked down the proverbial road yet again?
Yeah, the most likely scenario, and if anyone's betting on this, the best bet with Congress is that they will do the least hard thing. So in this situation, that means that they would likely just extend this current funding deadline yet again, kick it down, another 6 or 8 weeks. Where we start getting into issues is at the end of April. So April 30th is when some spending cuts would start to go into effect per a deal that Democrats and Republicans made about a year ago. So that's the real deadline for them to actually figure out how they want to fund the federal government. This is tricky. It was last summer under Kevin McCarthy, when he was still speaker, that Biden and McCarthy hashed out a deal on kind of what the top level spending levels would be. And then it's up to Congress to look at everything below that and figure out how much they're going to spend at each individual agency. That's the work that has to get done. Republicans want to move each of these bills individually, and that's technically how Congress is supposed to work, that you move all these separate bills. But generally what Congress has done, because it's a cumbersome process and a lot of times these bills get waylaid, is you move them all as one big package. So these are the kinds of talks they're going to be having over the next several weeks, and they're ultimately going to need more time, particularly because they're out for 3 of those 6 weeks that they have.
And so how do the dynamics change as silly season progresses, as we get closer to the election?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really going to be happening, over this same time period is it's very likely that Donald Trump will lock in the presidential nomination. So he will have even more sway. There will also be some discussions about, okay, if Trump is president, what do we want to get done before he's president? Interestingly, Democrats and Republicans both recognize it's going to be more difficult to get an immigration border security deal done if Trump is in the White House. Democrats are just not going to agree to a deal in the same way that they would now when they have a little bit more leverage with Biden. Some Republicans are also saying, look, we want to have this as an election issue. We want to be able to hit Democrats on this in the 2024 election. Let's not make a deal now, because then we lose some of our leverage there. So this, is kind of a complicated dance that frankly both parties don't agree on. You have a lot of different viewpoints within each party about what both the policy path should be as well as the political.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you're in D.C., so what's the feeling in D.C. as we head into the New Hampshire caucus about what the state of the Republican Party is and what November is going to continue to shape up like?
Yeah, so New Hampshire is an interesting state. It's very different from Iowa. It's a much more moderate state. You have more college-educated voters, more older voters there. And they are really kind of the last never Trump state on the calendar. Unlike Iowa, where Trump won by 30 points, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis were second and third, very close, but only getting about 20% of the vote each. In New Hampshire, Trump is polling about 40%, and Nikki Haley's somewhere in the mid-30s. So they're a lot closer. There's a chance she could win, but even still, even if she is able to upset Trump, the calendar going forward for her gets very difficult. The next race is in South Carolina. That's her home state, but it's actually a state that favors Trump now. So there's a lot of questions right now. If Haley is able to pull an upset, is she able to get donor support and other support? Will Ron DeSantis drop out, and that creates potentially more of a lane for her? But right now, the odds are on Donald Trump being president. But there's always surprises. He, of course, is somewhat about a wild card. There are all of his legal issues. So that's sort of Nikki Haley's theory of the case on why she could stay in.
Bloomberg News congressional reporter Laura Davison. I bet she owns a snow shovel. Thanks very much.
It all comes back to that in the S&P 500.
You think I'm living this down? No way. S&P 500, 31 points higher, 48.12 on the index. And that brings us to 12:33 on Wall Street. Let's get an update on news from around the world. We head to the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, and that's where you find Nancy Lyons. Hi, Nance.
Hey, John. You've been talking about it. All sides are breathing a sigh of relief that a partial government shutdown has been avoided for now. The House followed the Senate's lead yesterday and approved an extension until March. President Biden is expected to sign the stopgap bill today. 5 Arab nations are quietly touting a settlement for post-war Gaza, for which they've secured the backing of the U.S. Just one problem. The Israelis are not keen on the concept of a two-state solution, which is at the center of the proposal. Bloomberg's Roz Matheson has more on the dilemma.
The starting point for the U.S. and countries in the region is that you have to have a two-state solution to have a proper resolution of this issue in the longer term, so they can't agree on that. They won't be able to agree then on who's going to rule or manage Gaza in the aftermath of this conflict. Benjamin Netanyahu is now saying it can be a civil authority, but it has to be the one that he's comfortable with.
Bloomberg's news director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, Roz Matheson. Arab nations say they're also willing to invest in rebuilding Gaza, but they must have a promise from Israel the buildings will not be damaged or destroyed. Thousands of anti-abortion activists are marching in the nation's capital today for the 2024 March for Life. It's the group's second march in Washington since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Turnout, though, is expected to be lower than normal following a snowstorm in Washington. It's about to cost more to send letters in the mail. Come Sunday, the U.S. Postal Service will increase the cost of a first-class forever U.S. postage stamp from the current 66 cents to 68 cents. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And it is 12:40 on Wall Street. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are higher, flirting with record highs, as a matter of fact. You know how usually in January consumers are in kind of a funk as we stare down those credit card bills from the holidays, wonder how we'll pay for them? Well, that is not the case this year, apparently. Consumer confidence unexpectedly surging in early January. Inflation concerns waning. But watch out, all this optimism could mean more economic strength. According to Margie Patel, Senior Portfolio Manager at Allspring Global Investments, she says the Fed might not cut rates this year as soon or as deeply as some people think.
I think really we'll see rate cuts, maybe one or two in the second half. I don't see any reason to expect them to act in the first half. But of course, they'll want to be clear of the election. So if they don't act by summer, then they'll really be in a holding pattern until after the election.
Yeah, and Patel there on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast, which you can download wherever you get your podcast. Investors apparently not really too focused on this risk, though. Right now, the Dow up almost 0.5%, better by 174 points. S&P 500 up 0.6%, 29 points higher. NASDAQ up 0.8%, 128 points higher. Yield on the 10-year right now lower, 4.16%, we'll call it. NYMEX crude, it is down about 0.4%, 73.76 a barrel. Spot gold is up 0.2%. Amazon's proposed $1.4 billion acquisition of Roomba maker robot expected to be blocked by the European Union's antitrust regulator. That is over concerns the deal will harm other robot vacuum makers. Amazon shares, they're slightly higher on this. iRobot shares, they are plunging. They were down by almost 30% just a second ago. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Denise Pellegrini with the Bloomberg Business Flash. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. You are listening to Bloomberg Markets. I'm John Tucker, along with Bailey Lipschitz today. We are in for Paul and Matt. They always told me don't fight the Fed, but it looks like somebody's fighting the Fed, at least the bond market is. Will the markets and the Fed interact with how they're going to interact in 2024? Hans Olsen is CIO at Fiduciary Trust Company, joining us now, I think from Boston, to discuss. Boston, right? Did you get snow yet?
That's right, John.
Okay.
No snow yet.
All right. Well, I can tell you it's on its way. We're sending it up to you guys. So the market, as I said, the bond market at least is fighting the Fed. Does this set us up for some kind of disaster now?
I do think that this market is certainly overbought and overconfident, and I think you see it, the overbought view when you look at sort of the S&P's RSI, right, the relative strength. It has had one heck of a run. And it's corrected a bit from that, but now it looks like it's making another run to a real overbought position. And the overconfident bit is really clearly seen when you look at the difference between what the market expects for rate cuts and what the Fed is telegraphing. And so far, the economy is suggesting that perhaps the Fed is more right than is the market.
We were talking about it this morning. What do you make of the University of Michigan sentiment data, and how does that kind of impact your view on the path forward for markets and also the Fed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to focus on what people do versus what they say, and especially in markets, right? You follow the money, and without a doubt, I mean, it was a good read. I look back at what happened with retail sales in December, and that was pretty good. If you look at what's happening with employment, that's also quite good. So people, I think, are in pretty good rude economic health at the moment. Housing looks like it is going to be just fine, with the exception of today's numbers. But I think if you look forward with permits and the like, that all suggests that the economy is in rude health. So if that is the case, then one has to rethink sort of the timing and the extent of the interest rate cuts. And as you know, that 16% run in the end of 2023 was powered in large part by expectations around rates. It wasn't powered by earnings.
So we are headed for soft landing, no landing, hard landing, and which one of those scenarios do you think it's going to be, and what is that going to mean for risk assets?
Yeah, John, that's an interesting question because if I had told you last year at this time that that we would have interest rates where they were without some sort of resetting of economic activity, or certainly the market thought it'd be barking mad, but that's exactly what happened. So last year, in many respects, was a year of no landing. Because we didn't hit the Fed's target, and the market was fine, and the economy was fine. I think in many respects, there's a good chance that this year is going to be a year of either a softish landing or indeed possibly no landing, maybe a go round, right? Where we don't hit that Fed target. The economy is actually stronger than people are giving it credit for right now. And the markets can do pretty well with that. I think, though, the way that you make money in that environment is different than the way that you made it last year. Returns last year were all driven by multiple expansion, and it really happened in Q4 on the belief of rate cuts. So really that powered it. And it was not powered, was not assisted at all by earnings. This year, I think it has to be assisted by earnings. So, and I'm not sure that we can expect much on the multiple expansion front. So this is the year where I think stock picking really starts to matter. A focus on profits is probably the way to go here. So you get away from necessarily incredibly high valuations, but more to high quality, profitable companies being the prominent feature that people should be emphasizing in their equity portfolios this year.
Yeah, Hans, let's stick on that note in terms of what areas you do like. You mentioned profitability, maybe lower multiples. What areas, industries, or sectors are you liking for 2024 when it comes to the equity market?
Yeah, I think it's important because it'd be easy to talk sectors, but even within each sector, there are companies that have these features of what you would want this year. So, even some of the higher valued sectors, you would find companies that are incredibly profitable, really good allocation of capital, and which will drive some nice returns. I think from a sector standpoint, at this juncture, software, banks, oil and gas, computers, those would be areas that we can see companies living in that have the features that we want. And you can see that if you drill down into companies like an ExxonMobil, a Berkshire, an NVIDIA, and the like. These are companies that, they should have the wind at their back because the earnings are there and they're likely to grow. So I think that's how I would come at it, rather than just sort of do the passive S&P 500 exposure.
If we agree we're in a disinflationary environment, what does it do to earnings and sales?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it's disinflationary to what, right? So if we went from 9 to 3. I think we've seen that largely play out. If it goes from 3 down to where it had been for the last 5 or 6 years, that'd be another case. But I don't think that that's going to happen. I think it's really going to be now about margins and earnings growth. And to the extent that your cost of goods sold has some mixture of fixed in it versus floating, right? So you're not as susceptible to your input costs rising as much if you've hedged some of your inputs and the like. You can actually, interestingly, see your earnings rise in an environment where there's a bit higher inflation. So the details will matter in an environment like this.
Hans, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I was going to say snowy Boston, but not yet. It's on its way, Hans. I bet he has a shovel. Hans Olsen, CIO of Fiduciary Trust Company, joining us from Boston right now. Market reset. Yeah, 48.12 on the S&P 500, 31 points higher. So we are in course for a record close. This holds up 0.7% right now. Don't jinx it.
Dow Jones 6 points from the intraday high, which is when you won't see that nice hot head cross the terminal.
Okay. The Dow 204 points higher right now. That's up 0.5%. 37,670, and the Nasdaq 100 continues to add to its record close yesterday. It is up 1%, up 184 points, 17,166. This is Bloomberg Markets. And that brings us to 12:15 on Wall Street. Let's get an update on company news with Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
John, shares of Spirit Airlines are flying high as the carrier breathes hope into a grounded partnership. Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams has more.
Spirit Airlines is downplaying talk of a bankruptcy filing now that its planned sale to JetBlue has collapsed. At the same time, Reuters is reporting Spirit is seeking to convince JetBlue to appeal the decision, blocking their merger, but JetBlue has yet to decide on a course of action.
That's Bloomberg Kimberly Adams reporting. A federal judge concluded the $3.8 billion deal would stifle competition and drive up fares, but JetBlue argued the merger is vital to compete effectively with larger carriers. Amazon's proposed $1.4 billion takeover of Roomba maker iRobot could be in jeopardy. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti reports.
Bloomberg News has learned the deal is expected to be blocked by the European Union's antitrust regulator over concerns it will harm other robot vacuum cleaners. And here in the U.S., the Federal Trade Commission is said to be drafting a lawsuit that would seek to block the deal.
That's Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti reporting. And Prince Harry is dropping his libel lawsuit against the publisher of the Daily Mail tabloid. No reason was given, but the move follows a ruling last month where the Duke of Sussex was ordered to pay Associated Newspapers more than $60,000 in legal fees. That was after he failed to win a summary judgment, which would give him a victory without going to trial. And those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Steve Rappaport. This is Bloomberg. More Bloomberg Markets coming up right after this.
You're listening to Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Radio.
And that brings us to 12:55 on Wall Street. I'm John Tucker along with Bailey Lipschultz. Let's get an update of news from around the world now. After that, we head to a snowy Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington and Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, John. Well, the snow is not letting up, as you mentioned, along the eastern seaboard. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says while this storm is not particularly powerful, it is affecting quite a bit of real estate.
For the major cities, it's a couple of inches around New York and also in the Baltimore and Washington areas. Boston will see less than an inch. Looks like some of the towns south of Boston, though, could see as much as 1 to 3 inches.
Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn says the most snow, though, is expected between Philadelphia, Trenton, Dover, Delaware, with 4 inches expected. Airports continue to see delays and cancellations. Senate Democrats are renewing calls to reauthorize pandemic preparedness legislation. We get more on that from Bloomberg's Amy Morris.
After a Senate hearing on long COVID, Democratic Senator John Hickenlooper of Colorado said it would be, quote, very feasible to reauthorize the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act with funding. But Democrats recognize immigration and the budget will be dominating the conversation on Capitol Hill for a while. PAHPA, or PAPA, expired September 30th, and the latest stopgap bill only extends some health security measures through March 8th. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden is forgiving nearly $5 billion in additional student debt as the administration seeks to deliver on one of his signature initiatives. With extremely high stakes for his 2024 re-election campaign, almost 74,000 student loan borrowers will see debt canceled as a result of administrative changes by the U.S. Education Department. This is in the latest round of relief. Those affected include borrowers enrolled in the government's income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness programs. The NFL divisional round of the playoffs kick off tomorrow. The Houston Texans will travel to Baltimore to take on the Ravens. In the NFC on Saturday night, the Green Bay Packers head to the West Coast to face the San Francisco 49ers. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
I'm going to guess you're a Ravens fan, right? Ravens?
Oh, yes. We got to have the Ravens win.
Okay, Nancy.
The Packers fan, too.
I'm a Packers fan. Actually, a Packers owner, so double duty.
But I'm rooting for the San Francisco 49ers this time.
I guess we're not going to talk on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday.
Whatever it is.
I have one of my neighbors, former neighbors, plays for the 49ers, so.
Oh, wow. Very impressive. Nancy Lyons from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. One of the most read stories, the Bloomberg terminal, this has to do, these are always popular stories like rankings, like, you know, who's the richest, whatever, who's doing the most deals. This one has to do with states. Who's the richest? Which is the richest state in terms of per capita income?
Right now, it is Massachusetts.
Because Massachusetts has just beat out Connecticut and beat them out by a measly $10 in per capita income. Is that
No,
right?
that was 2020.
Oh, okay.
2020. Now it's about $1,200, but it was $10 in.
Oh, it's still pretty close, though.
Yeah, they're neck and neck. I mean, the gap between them and our Garden State is closer to $6,000, which is
New Jersey, I should point out, where we both live, is in third place. And it's not like we contribute to that number in any way, shape, or form. So,
and California's in fourth. California's always a state, JT, that I wonder if you broke these up by southern versus northern, how that breaks down, because you have to imagine.
Well, I would like to see it broken down by counties or even towns, because in my neck of the woods, the town over is just like, you know,
huge,
millionaire plus territory.
Yeah, I'm a couple towns over from where Aaron Rodgers bought a house. His property looks nothing like mine. He has someone who shovels his driveway, unlike me.
Bailey Lipschultz with us today on Bloomberg Markets, and I have to compliment you because you've been doing some magnificent metaphorical shoveling for the past 3 hours or so. I'm John Tucker, and I'm in, I don't know, I guess I'm in for Paul. You're in for Matt Miller.
Yeah, we're a point away from S&P 500 intraday high. Just going to say that right before we sign off.
Okay, 48.17 on the index, up 36 points. That is up 0.75%. Stay with us. Bloomberg Sound On. That starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself. Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
It's the final stretch to New Hampshire, and a big endorsement coming, it seems, for Donald Trump. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, the Friday edition of Sound On. As the candidates descend on Manchester, and now news that Senator Tim Scott will back the former president. Is this over? Or can Nikki Haley pull a rabbit out of a hat? That's what we're talking about today as we discuss the seeming inevitability of a Donald Trump nomination with the man who wrote the book. Tim O'Brien is here, Bloomberg opinion columnist, the author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. The government will not shut down today, I can tell you that, as the snow falls in Washington. But that's about all we can tell you as Speaker Mike Johnson faces a growing rebellion on his right flank. We'll talk it all out with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us for the hour, and we get to all of it after a look at Wall Street. We go to New York right now for an update on trading from Denise Pellegrini. Hey, Denise.
Thank you. It is 101 on Wall Street. We check the markets for you, of course, all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks flirting with record highs. We do have word, though, that Macy's and Wayfair are cutting thousands of jobs. Macy's shares, they are lower. Wayfair shares, though, they are surging. And Dan Suzuki, Deputy CIO, Richard Bernstein Advisors, says, don't worry too much about the retail industry.
My personal opinion is if you look at the drivers of consumption like labor and wages and overall economic growth, it's going to be gradually slowing here. And so I think it's normal to expect that to gradually slow, but clearly not fall off a cliff.
And Suzuki there on Bloomberg Television. As I mentioned, we've got green across the screen. The Dow up just about 0.6%, 242 points better. The S&P 500 up almost 0.8%, 36 points, so close. We're just 1 point off an intraday record high right now. Working on it for you. We'll see if we can squeeze that out. NASDAQ higher again today as well. The yield on the 10-year right now, lower, 4.15%. Spot gold, it is higher, better by just about 0.2%. And NYMEX crude, it is lower. It's been lower all day, down about 0.7%. It's $78.51 a barrel. And Apple shares, they are up almost 1%. As we've been talking about Apple's Vision Pro mixed reality headset up for pre-orders today. Either there aren't very many of these, Joe, or demand is strong, because if you look now, you will have to wait until March. The first people to order will be getting theirs February 2nd, if you ordered one early this morning. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash, Joe.
Denise, thank you. We'll check in a bit later for an update on trading throughout the program. Welcome to the Friday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I have news. Before we get to the news, this is the last edition of Sound On as you know it, as I know it. When we come back on Monday, we'll be at an earlier time, 12 noon Washington time. And it's going to work a little bit differently here. And by that, I mean in a better way. We'll have our first hour on the radio as it is now and on YouTube. And our second hour will be carried when Kaylee Lyons joins us for hour 2. Will be carried on Bloomberg TV. And I hope that you'll be with us for the process. Our signature panel will be here, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. And, you know, we like to do things big. We're going to start this in New Hampshire on Monday. Yes, we're all getting on planes this weekend to bring you the very latest from the first in the nation primary, which could be a last stand for Nikki Haley. It could be the galvanizing moment for Donald Trump. It could be embarrassing for Ron DeSantis. We'll go through it together. And I have news here. We've been talking polls all week, but this is interesting and not the headline that I thought we'd see today. Senator Tim Scott, now set to endorse Donald Trump, just days out from the primary, a former candidate and a man who is widely admired throughout the Republican Party. Getting involved on this level is pretty incredible. This is where we start our conversation with Tim O'Brien, Bloomberg opinion columnist, and of course, as I mentioned, the man who wrote the book on Donald Trump. Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald, is with us in studio. It's always a pleasure to have you in Washington.
It's always a treat, Joe. Sorry for the snow. Washington snow is not bad snow.
Well,
I grew up in Chicago.
It's sweepable, right?
It's
Today,
sweepable.
no one's having a heart attack.
Yeah, it always
shoveling
cracks
this
me
stuff.
up how it shuts the city down.
They canceled school last night before a flake.
Yeah, it's,
but
come
we
on,
could
people.
do a whole show on
All right.
that. Donald Trump would still fly in and go back home and sleep in his own bed based on what we've seen. I want to talk to you about the apparent inevitability storyline here. But first of all, are you surprised to hear about Tim Scott?
I'm not. I mean, I think that anybody who sees themselves as a Republican in Donald Trump's Republican Party is inevitably going to come in behind him. I think it's craven because we're in primary season. And so we haven't really road tested these ideas with a general electorate. And I think it was ordained that he was going to do well in this primary because the most motivated part of the Republican base comes out in the primaries, and that's right now the MAGA base.
Yes. You'd think maybe he'd do this on the eve of South Carolina, which is still weeks away. But he's jumping in before New Hampshire, clearly an attempt to winnow the field or maybe eliminate the field.
And I also think to get, a possible position in a Trump administration, which is, and I think, I think one of the problems with Nikki Haley's candidacy is that she hasn't been sharply defining herself apart from Trump. She's watching people like Chris Christie, who fell by the wayside, who did. So there's a political calculation.
Is she keeping the door open for something, or just wants to be available for the MAGA base if Donald Trump is not?
That was Ron DeSantis' strategy, and that has failed.
How about it?
And there is only one Donald Trump for the MAGA base, and I don't think Ron DeSantis was Trump light. I think he was a bad candidate. He lacks Trump's charisma. He lacks the real emotional bond Trump has with his voters. You can't fake that. And it's one of Trump's great political strengths and advantages is that he has an authentic emotional bond with his core supporters.
Well, so knowing him to the extent that you do, are we really going through this all over again? Have you committed yourself to another Trump-Biden race?
Well, yeah, I think it's absolutely going to be Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I think people that thought Joe Biden was going to step aside misunderstand how long he's wanted that job. People who thought Donald Trump was going to step aside misunderstood how long he's wanted to be perpetually in the public spotlight. And he's got legal issues hanging over his head that his presidency would solve.
Joe Biden's conventional wisdom until now was that's the one guy we want because we know we can beat him. We were afraid more of a Nikki Haley or maybe a Ron DeSantis becoming the nominee. Is that a foolish view based particularly on some of the swing state polling that Bloomberg has done?
I think it's true that Trump is the most ideal candidate for Joe Biden to run against.
You think he can beat him again?
I think it's going to be on a razor's edge. I think that I think he would have had more trouble with Nikki Haley than he will have with Donald Trump.
Are you counting her out then? This is
I think she's probably done. I think both she and Ron DeSantis are done by South Carolina.
Well,
I could end up being wrong. I think she'll come in second in New Hampshire. The polls are suggesting she's 8 points behind. It might be more than that. DeSantis will be nowhere in New Hampshire. And if she loses in South Carolina, which is her home state, she was the governor of South Carolina. I don't see how, Michigan follows, and then you have Super Tuesday. But we don't may not even get to Super Tuesday. And obviously, it's the same is true of Biden with the Democrats. He's going to be the nominee.
So this is Donald Trump's, third, technically, presidential campaign. What will an emboldened, post-January 6th, emboldened Trump look like this time around?
As a candidate or as president?
As a candidate.
As a candidate, I think he'll do what he's continued to do, which is, both the entrance and the exit polls in Iowa, two of the top responses for why Trump appealed to his voters were he fights for us and he shares our values. And I think when his supporters say he fights for us, he is fighting for, he identifies as being a victim. Despite the fact that he's a wealthy white male who's had every advantage in life. The idea that he's a victim is comically absurd, but he understands and he's played that card repeatedly. I feel your pain. Sure. The institutions are out to get you. They're out to get me. They're coming at me in a different way.
A billionaire, in that case.
And a celebrity and a president. He has so many disadvantages: wealth, celebrity, white American. It's the things he's had to struggle with are extraordinary.
Bone spurs.
Right, but bone spurs, yeah. But he has said that there's no traction of these legal charges against him. It is the institutions coming at him in the same way they've come after you, dear voters. Therefore, I might be a dictator for a day. It'll only be a day. Right. I might try to run again after this administration. Who knows? I know that legally I'm not allowed to, but I might do it anyway. Because you need a dictator to take care of you. And this has real traction with his voters.
A lot of people think they do, apparently.
Yeah.
And would go through 30-degree below zero weather to caucus for him after dinner in Iowa.
Yes.
We're watching this happen in real time. How far out of the lines, though, could he be playing as a candidate this time? Because he knows that he's the exception to every rule.
He is, but also, one of the things he's doing now that he didn't do in 2016 when he first came on the scene in a seismic way is he has professionalized his campaign operation. Right. He had, I think, over 1,000 precinct captains on the ground in Iowa. He wasn't there. He didn't need to be there. The victory speech he gave in Iowa was for Donald Trump, about as diplomatic as you get. It lasted about 10 seconds, but you got some of that.
Speech,
and good job, Nikki, and good job, Ron, and my mom and dad are looking at me from heaven, and all that stuff. And as opposed to, I'm going to rip your guts out and hang you in the public square, which is generally where he resides.
It was about 24 hours before the racial slurs started against Nikki Haley on Truth Social.
Yeah.
The missives on Truth Social would suggest that we have not matured, maybe gotten worse when it comes to that.
It works for him. Yeah. It's not just, we have to really understand Donald Trump through the prism of the people who support him, not just Donald Trump himself. And what he has done is peeled back this Band-Aid on ideas we have in the U.S. about how much progress we've made around racial justice or economic equity. That there's still a lot of that boiling over with the electorate itself.
Yeah. Will he sink a border deal if one comes along? He's on the phone apparently with the Speaker of the House on the regular.
This Congress and this Republican Congress has no interest in getting a border deal done because they want to hang the immigration albatross around
so this is all a charade,
Biden's neck. There are, Lindsey Graham is saying there's a number of Republicans who are saying this is the best border deal they're going to get, even if Trump comes in the White House.
That's right.
It should get done, yet they're not doing it.
Those who have been there are saying this. Those with experience.
Yeah. So if they cared about public policy and taking care of the border and our border states that are dealing with an out-of-control migration problem, they would get this deal done. And they're not getting it done to score political points. It doesn't make sense from a public policy standpoint.
Wow.
It doesn't make sense from a national standpoint. But it does make sense from scoring points. And I think the Biden administration will have to point out to voters that the reason immigration is now in chaos from a policy standpoint and from an enforcement standpoint along the border is because this Congress doesn't want to pass the legislation that would address it.
It's going to be a tough sell because
they
hold up H.R. 2 and then the thing goes around again. You asked me, as a candidate or as a president? Now, Donald Trump as a president, let's see, he closes the deal. Then we really drain the swamp. We put in the action plan to replace the bureaucracy with something we've never seen before.
Right. I think there's two things there. He will not drain the swamp because he lives in the swamp. And he said he was going to drain it last time, and he just brought in bigger alligators.
Okay.
So he has no interest in sort of ending the money wheel in Washington. I do think he has an interest in dismantling the federal government, the agencies that exist as part of the executive branch. And I think in an ideal world, we would have a very healthy public debate about where expertise should reside around policymaking. Should it belong in agencies? Should it belong in the Congress or in the Supreme Court? And then how do we use that effectively to drive policy? That's not the conversation he wants to have. He just wants to get rid of most agencies but keep the Defense Department and the Justice Department so he can weaponize both against his critics.
Wow. You ready to cover that?
We have to cover that. This is a seismic moment in American history. This isn't just another political race. This is really testing how we think about American democracy and the rule of law and the Constitution. And I think the more we cover it as a horse race and the less we look at foundationally who we are as a country, I don't think we serve our listeners and readers well.
Will you stay in touch with us through the year on this program?
If you'll stay in touch with me, because I always like talking to you.
This is really important. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you this. What's it like to be sued by Donald Trump?
Oh, you can ask me, and I'll give you an answer that drives my wife, who's a lawyer, nuts, is that I actually enjoyed the process because we deposed him and we got access to his business records and bank records and through the litigation, and the work stood up. The court upheld the integrity of the work. He lost the case.
Was your phone ringing at night, though? People were driving by the house? Living through that
You know, there's
time
always
must
a
have been-
price of covering Donald Trump
Yeah.
where the people who support him
Right.
come after you personally, but c'est la vie.
Tim O'Brien, great to see you.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for
Joe.
coming.
Good to see
we're
you.
off to New Hampshire tomorrow, and we'll talk to you when we get back.
All right.
He runs the Bloomberg opinion operation here, which you can always find on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Tim O'Brien, the author of the book Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald, as we get things started here, going into a weekend that might play in a very big way for Donald Trump. Let's assemble the panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are here, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, you've spent more time in New Hampshire than most Republican strategists. How are you feeling on this weekend before the primary?
You know, I'm actually surprised there's not more sort of cliff-hanging indecision by people. The polls are all coming in really consistent, and you know, polling is got a rich history in New Hampshire. There's an enormous amount of data available from just really fantastic organizations that are used to doing it. And it all usually turns out to be a little bit wrong. So today we wake up and Donald Trump's winning this thing. He's got over 50% in a few of these really credible surveys. And that's going to be really hard to overcome for Nikki Haley. For whatever reason, Donald Trump benefited from his time in Iowa and she didn't. She's kind of stalled out in these polls with what she had going into Iowa. And maybe it was Vivek Ramaswamy's endorsement and his votes. But the bottom line is she's got to be really coming from behind to make this work. And tons of good questions out there about what level the independents are going to show up, the unaffiliateds. They always play an important role in New Hampshire primary politics. And that's probably the biggest question right now.
Jeannie, Nikki Haley held a town hall on CNN last night. She was asked about some of the insults that she's been getting from Donald Trump recently. She said, do you really want two 80-year-olds running for president when we have a country and a world on fire? But she said, I will continue to focus on things people want to talk about and not get into name calling. Is that the right tone here on the eve of the primary?
It's not working for her, and the polls tell the story. And I'm glad she was out on CNN, but quite frankly, people in New Hampshire report she hasn't been out on their airways enough. She needs a Hail Mary at this point. She doesn't seem like she is jumping at one. She's turned down some interviews. She's been out on the stump, but it's been in northern New Hampshire and other places. So I'm not sure that her argument she's going to stay above the fray is working for her. Yeah. And in fact, if you believe the polls, they're saying it's not.
We're going to find out together. Rick and Jeannie are going with us. We're headed to New Hampshire this weekend. We're going to pick up on this news of an endorsement, though, as we get the panel's reaction to Tim Scott making it official, coming in behind Donald Trump just before New Hampshire. It's the fastest show in politics from snowy Washington. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And it is 1:21 on Wall Street. I'm Denise Pellegrini. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500, well, it has just hit another intraday high. And that's all on the back of unexpectedly strong consumer sentiment and also waning inflation concerns. The Dow right now better by 0.8%, 302 points higher. The S&P 500 up 0.9%, 44 points higher, sitting at 48.24 right now. Just about 6 or 7 points higher than the previous intraday high. We'll see if we can hold things there and get another record close for the S&P 500. And the NASDAQ up 1.2%, 174 points higher. The yield on the 10-year right now, it is lower, 1.4, that would be amazing, 4.16% right now. Spot gold up 0.2%. NYMEX crude down just about 0.7%, 73.56 a barrel. And Brian Vending, president at MJP Advisors, well, he tells us there are a lot of opportunities in investing in certain sectors right now. He picks healthcare.
We are looking at areas of some of the biotech, some of the big pharma space areas, because the big pharma companies, they're building out, they're going out and acquiring other companies right now and building out their pipeline for new therapies and drugs. And I think as rates change, we might see a little bit more in that M&A space from healthcare.
And Vendig there on the Bloomberg Markets podcast, which you can download wherever you get your podcasts. And speaking of healthcare, shares of Humana, they're among those in focus. They're trading lower today. You know, they're down more than 10% on the year. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Piece of news from the White House. In my constant effort to say something positive on this broadcast, the government is not going to shut down today. I say that officially. Just got word from the White House the president has signed the stopgap government funding bill that Congress ushered through yesterday. So there we go. We head into this weekend without a shutdown on our hands. The question is what happens in March, because we've got another ladder here. This would mean an expiration March 1st and on March 8th. And if you think about what's going to happen in that period of time between Super Tuesday, the potential start, the scheduled start of Donald Trump's trial, and President Biden's State of the Union, that should be interesting. None of these things happen in a vacuum, right? Keep that in mind. Speaking of which, big news on the campaign trail as we prepare to go to New Hampshire. This is the one Nikki Haley was, gosh, she must have been hoping for. Everybody was. To get the endorsement of Senator Tim Scott. It's going to Donald Trump. And this is an important bit of reporting on behalf of Bloomberg. He will endorse Donald Trump this evening at a rally in Concord, New Hampshire, according to those familiar, speaking on condition of anonymity. Let's reassemble the panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. This is one that actually could make a difference in terms of helping Donald Trump, Jeannie, no?
It could. I mean, it is her home state. He is senator in large part because of her. They did mix it up a bit in the debates, of course, but the idea that he would endorse now, it really, I think, shows you and is a reflection of how much the Republican establishment, and not just the MAGA wing of the party, is owned by Donald Trump. You know, Tim Scott follows Marco Rubio. You know, just the sheer number of endorsements that Donald Trump has out of Congress is a reflection of his strength and his ownership of the party, making it all that much more tougher for Nikki Haley to have any kind of surprise win in New Hampshire. It could happen, but it is becoming increasingly less likely as the hours go by.
What do you make of the timing here, Rick? Not only is the call coming from inside the House, this endorsement from South Carolina that he could have waited a couple weeks, you know, to have an impact in his own state. Doing this on the eve of New Hampshire, does this feel like a party that wants to get this over with?
Yeah, I'm sure the Trump people pressed him to do it while they are in the pre-New Hampshire balloting. Look, I mean, it's not like he's going to help Donald Trump with conservatives, which is his base, and especially evangelicals, because Trump's already getting a lion's share of those votes. There's nothing really going to be beneficial to him, but he could have been a gateway to those voters looking and saying, well, if Tim Scott's going to go for Nikki Haley, then we're comfortable doing that too. So the predicate now isn't going to get set. And Nikki, although she's doing extremely well with independents in New Hampshire, she failed in really crossover voting and getting conservatives in Iowa, and she needs those conservatives in New Hampshire to compete with Donald Trump, and she's just not getting them. So this is a huge disappointment, I'm sure, for Nikki Haley and her campaign, because they, I think, saw Tim Scott as that permission structure for Republicans who are conservative or evangelical to be willing to support her. And now she's not going to get it.
You can frame that, Rick, about how sought after that was. Maybe I should ask that in a different way. How popular he is inside the party. He has the respect of his colleagues.
Yes, I mean, both on Capitol Hill with his fellow senators, you know, so within the institution of the Senate, he's considered a very solid, very thoughtful member. But at home, he's the hometown kid. He's the guy from the other side of the tracks who made good. His personal story is immensely compelling to South Carolinian voters. And even though he wasn't successful conveying that to a broader audience of Republicans around the country, he was able to have an impact in a lot of circles in this campaign. And so, yeah, I mean, he's kind of the gold standard of Republicans, especially in the South right now, when you have the swirl of discussions around slavery and racism that have sort of populated this last couple of days on the campaign trail. You know, he is the safest harbor you're going to find politically.
Jeannie, are you feeling like this is over now, that it's a party that wants to pull the ripcord and just make Donald Trump the nominee?
Well, historically, New Hampshire has delivered surprises. So that is always something I keep in the back of my mind. But and Rick knows that better than anybody, but if you trust the polls, which I know a lot of people don't, I do, they would have to be wildly off for her to win. Could she come in close? I think that's possible. But even if she does, she's going to do it on the backs of independents, Democrats, and that is going to be something that Donald Trump is just chomping at the bit to use. You know, she has a big problem now. She has been defined oddly as Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson and other Never Trumpers have left the race. She has become really the poster child of the Never Trumpers, which is, you know, not a place she wants to be if she hopes to win the Republican primary at this point. And of course, it's stunning because this is Nikki Haley. Let's not forget, she had the endorsements of Mitt Romney and Sarah Palin to become governor. She was part of that Tea Party movement. But now she is nothing of the sort. She is, you know, Chris Christie, you know, of the female variety. And, you know, it's not a fair way she's been characterized. But, you know, going back to how Donald Trump now wants to make her Hillary Clinton, this is what she has become. They had to fight that hard early, and her campaign has stumbled in doing that.
You just said a lot there. That's fascinating, Jeannie. Rick, what do you think about the fact that Nikki Haley was rebranded to such an extent from others? Is that the biggest failure of this campaign?
Well, I think it's the biggest failure of Nikki Haley's campaign. You know, Jeannie's right. I mean, she is a conservative in South Carolina. She got elected ahead of the current governor, who's considered a scion of conservatism in South Carolina. I mean, you know, her credentials as a conservative are impeccable. But when you go through a campaign, you get redefined. And when you run against Donald Trump, he's the one who gets to define you. Remember, he's got the megaphone, right? He's got 100% name ID. They've all had to try to earn it. In the course of doing that, he's been able to define Ron DeSantis very effectively, long before Ron DeSantis even actually got into the race. And with Nikki Haley turning his sights on her around the time of the Iowa caucuses, the barrage has been very significant, both in advertising and, of course, in his own comments that get picked up all over the world. So, yeah, it's very hard to maintain your ideological clarity in a campaign against Donald Trump, who actually has no ideological clarity. He benefits from being whatever he wants to be any given day. And so it's very hard to pin him down. So yeah, as I said, she's been identified as someone the independents want because it's not Donald Trump. She has not cut into that conservative base of people who want an option to Trump, but want to be comfortable that they have someone who will pursue his policies without all the chaos. That was her campaign, and it just hasn't stuck.
Jeannie, you mentioned the polls. We've got now a daily tracking poll leading up to the primary that's being done by Suffolk University. David Paleologos, who was on with us a couple of days ago, working with the Boston Globe. Trump 52, Haley 35. He's got a 17-point lead here. It really doesn't matter the rest of the field. Ron DeSantis is all the way down at 6. By the way, Trump in this poll up 2 since the last one. Haley is down 1. If we're gauging momentum and direction, at least, that's where we stand. And I'll keep tabs on that for you throughout the weekend. And leading into Monday, we'll have Mr. Paleologos with us from Manchester next week to set the baseline on where we are when voting begins. We've still got a couple of days to go through here, but boy, trends sure seem to be taking hold. We're going to continue our conversation with Rick and Jeannie as we look at what the heck is happening on Capitol Hill. And an interesting narrative now surrounding this whole border agreement. You heard Tim O'Brien say earlier that Republicans don't actually want a deal. In some cases, it's sounding more like when Don Jr. just jumped on the no border deal bandwagon. We'll have more on that next after we check world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. President Biden says U.S. airstrikes against Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen will continue, even though they have not halted the group's attacks on Red Sea shipping. Bloomberg government Zach Cohen has more from Washington.
Goal here is that the White House is hoping to deter future attacks, either by sort of stopping an imminent missile strike or at least getting the Houthis to step back from their strikes. But it seems at this point that they're going to keep up as long as Israel is attacking Gaza in an effort to wipe out Hamas after the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas, which is a U.S.-designated terrorist group, or some other sort of peace deal.
Bloomberg government Zach Cohen. The Biden administration is forgiving nearly $5 billion in student debt for about 74,000 Americans. The White House says more than half of borrowers eligible for the debt relief are teachers, nurses, firefighters, and others who would have been on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program for 10 years. It's the latest round of debt cancellation since the Supreme Court struck down the president's sweeping student loan forgiveness program. Today marks National Popcorn Day. Movie theaters across the country will be celebrating with special offers. AMC Theaters will be giving moviegoers unlimited refills on every size of popcorn. Cinemark will be discounting medium and large popcorn. Dine-in theater chain Alamo Drafthouse will be giving out free bowls of popcorn with a purchase of a movie ticket. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And it is 1:40 on Wall Street. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Denise Pellegrini. A lot of green on the screen this TGIF trading session. And the S&P 500, well, it has just crossed a new intraday high, and it is holding there. Strong consumer sentiment, a theme. U.S. sentiment this month hitting the highest since 2021, exceeding expectations as those inflation worries ease. Federal Reserve Bank Chicago President Austin Goolsbee says a continued decline in inflation would mean talking about cutting interest rates would be warranted, but Tony Crescenzi, market strategist over at Portfolio Manager and member of the firm's investment committee at PIMCO, says the Fed hasn't achieved price stability yet, and he says the Fed might not cut rates as soon as you think.
It has to be cautious about acting too soon, because the key lesson of history is to keep at it, as Paul Volcker said, and keeping at it is his book from 2018, until the job is done.
And Crescenzi there on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast, which you can download wherever you get your podcast. The Dow right now up 0.9%, better by 345 points. The S&P 500 up 1%, 48 points higher, 48.28 right now. That's about 10 points higher than that last intraday high we're holding there. If we close there, that'll be another record high. The NASDAQ, it's 1.3% higher right now. That is better by 194 points. Yield on the 10-year right now, it is lower, 4.16%. Spot gold up about 0.2%, 2,026 an ounce. NYMEX crude down about 0.6%, 73.66 a barrel. Macy's laying off thousands of employees. That stock's down about 3%. Online home furnishings company Wayfair, though, it's cutting about 13% of its workforce, more than 1,600 employees. But analysts over at Raymond James calling this an impressive move. They like that move. Wayfair shares up almost 12%. Also, we're getting word of layoffs now at Sports Illustrated. This is big. We'll have more on that coming up for you in just a few minutes. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The government will not shut down today. This is good news, obviously. We don't have that to worry about, at least for a couple more weeks. March 1st and 8th now are new dates to circle on the calendar if you're playing along on your home game. God knows we can't get very far here, although some are suggesting that if we need another continuing resolution, they just do it for the rest of the fiscal year. I mean, we're already halfway there, right? What is the point? Some would say the sequester, because in April, that's when the automatic cuts kick in. There will be pain, or at least a price to pay for what's going on here if they can't figure this out. But the no votes, the House passed what the Senate sent over yesterday. The no votes are remarkable. The vote in the House, 314 to 108. Hey, pop the corks. We're not going to shut down. But guess what? Mike Johnson's leadership team, Elise Stefanik, voted no. You know who else? 8 chairs in the House. This isn't all MAGA. The budget chair, by the way, among them, Jody Arrington, the guy who's supposed to write a budget. Chair of the China Select Committee, Mike Gallagher, been on this program. Homeland Chair Mike Green. The chair of the Admin Committee, Brian Stile. I think we can argue a very mainstream Republican. He's talked to us many times on this program. Ethics Chair Mike Guest, all no votes. So what does that mean about where we're going? Did they simply think they had the cover to do this knowing it would pass? Or is there a real fissure inside this Republican conference? We reassembled the panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are here. Rick, what do these no votes tell you about the standing of Speaker Mike Johnson?
Yeah, they knew it was a free vote, as you point out. It was going to pass as soon as they scheduled the vote. So a lot of these folks are playing politics, right? And if you're a committee chair or leadership, you actually probably are hedging that Johnson's not going to last the year. I just as soon have a track record of something that's going to let me be speaker. I mean, like, why wouldn't you? That's been the standard, for the last 12 months is, don't take votes that'll get you to the chairmanship or to the speakership, but don't worry about it if it doesn't matter. And it didn't matter. I mean, this was going to pass. And I think there's a lot of chatter right now as to whether or not the supplemental vote will run along the same lines.
Well, that's right, Jeannie. How do you read into these no votes to consider what will happen? And it could, by the way, be as early as next week when a supplemental bill comes over from the Senate that includes money for big bad Ukraine.
I mean, can we just agree that the House is basically not functioning at this point in the way it should be? I mean, they have kicked the can down 40 days for keeping the government running. Every time we talk about the budget, I think to myself, are we budgeting for 25? Oh no, we're still on 24, but it is 24. I mean, it is insanity that this is the way we are governing ourselves. There's absolutely right. They are doing this for their own personal reasons. Elise Stefanik, for instance, she wants to be vice president. She's getting, doing the bidding of Donald Trump. So there's so many reasons why this is happening. And the reality is in the Republican Party today, working with Democrats, which is what they should be doing in a very narrowly divided House, is seen as something that means they are anti-Republican. And so there's simply so many, even these leadership folks who won't do it. And I'm not sure why any of them want to be Speaker of the House in the future. It is the worst job in Washington, if not the United States today. So I don't know what they're all vying for.
Here. God knows it. Well, let's explore this scenario here, Rick, that was outlined in the tip sheets this morning. Democrats consider trading Speaker Johnson a border deal for a couple of warm bodies who could help him keep the gavel if there is a motion to vacate. Different than what happened with Kevin McCarthy, that there'd be a couple of Democrats on the floor there to save his speakership if he actually works with Democrats on a border deal. Does that sound like good politics?
Look, I mean, it would be historic, right? Nobody has been able to get a border deal done in decades, not since Ronald Reagan. And so if you're this speaker and you look in the mirror and you say, what am I going to be known for? Why not be the guy that finally got something done to secure the border and supported our democratic allies in Ukraine and in Taiwan? I mean, that's a pretty good day's work for a guy who may not last the year as speaker. So, I'd take that deal in a nanosecond. You're right. The Democrats did not offer that deal to Kevin McCarthy, and it ultimately was his downfall. So, I think it's worth taking. Everyone I've talked to on Capitol Hill scratching their head wondering, like, why in the world, if Trump thinks he's going to be president, wouldn't he want us to do this deal? Because it's going to give him all these new tools to secure the border on day one.
He's recruited Don Jr., apparently, to the anti-border deal campaign. It's interesting, some of the names that are popping up on this, but this is a real effort now, it appears, Jeannie. What do you think of this idea of Democrats protecting Speaker Johnson? Is that reality? This came up with Kevin McCarthy, and they laughed at us when we asked about it.
Did I just hear Rick Davis say that he's shocked that Donald Trump is not doing something that is sensible? I mean, the reality is Donald Trump is thinking of one thing, himself and punishing his enemies. Enemy number one is Joe Biden. The last thing he wants to do is allow Joe Biden a win on the border. So not going to happen. I'm going to go out on a limb and say we will not see a border deal. Democrats can play around with trying to save MJ. That's what I call him now, MJ's job. I'm not sure that's going to happen either. Why? Because why doesn't Mike Johnson, MJ, want to be the persona non grata in the Republican Party, which he would be if he struck this deal? I still think Joe Biden should call their bluff. Yes, we'll do whatever you want. Give me HR2, give me something. Because quite frankly, what does he have to lose? He's getting killed on the border. Wow. But I go back to, I don't think any of it's going to happen. I think they will just continue to stay out of it.
That'd be a risky play. We got less than a minute, Rick. Should Joe Biden call their bluff? I'm ready to sign HR2 if you send it to me.
No, I mean, I first of all, that's an awful tough pill for him to swallow. I mean, he's got enough problems with his base.
Guess that's probably unlikely, but a fascinating scenario. And it proves the point, Jeannie. You do wonder, whatever comes over from the Senate, obviously it's going to be cut up here. But would anything stand a chance in this House right now? It just remains to be seen. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will have some final thoughts ahead. We have an important anniversary on the campaign trail here. The Scream. We'll talk about that ahead. Kaylee Lyons will come in at the top of the hour, and a conversation next hour as well with Bharat Ramamurthy, formerly of the White House, on the economy. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And from Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Denise Pellegrini. We have another sign the electric vehicle industry is running out of charge. Ford cutting production of its F-150 Lightning electric pickup. Now, this will impact about 1,400 employees. Ford boosting production of the Bronco SUV and Ranger pickups instead of that. And David Lefkowitz, head of U.S. equity strategy at UBS Global Wealth Management, says this is a challenging time for EV makers, but he says don't read too much into this pullback.
We're getting into the part of the market where, yeah, it may take a little bit more effort to sort of penetrate the market. But I don't think this is a broader read on the health of the consumer.
And Lefkowitz there on the Bloomberg Surveillance podcast, which you could download wherever you get your podcasts. Sports Illustrated laying off most of its staff, possibly all remaining writers and editors receiving layoff notice today, according to the union, putting the future of the iconic magazine in serious doubt right now. Now, the union of the staff does say it will continue to fight for publication of the magazine, but it also says the future is now in the hands of the owner. That's Authentic Brands Group. More job cuts over at Wayfair. The online home furnishings company says it's giving more than 1,600 workers the ask. That's about 13% of its workforce and 19% of its global corporate team. It's also reducing seniority of some employees. Shares of Wayfair, though, analysts like this one, shares are up about 9%. And we're now hearing that OpenAI Chief Executive Officer Sam Altman is looking to set up a new chip venture. Sources say he's aiming to use the funds to set up a network of facilities.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from snowy Washington, where schools are canceled, but the government is still open. Yes, it's not shutting down today. The president actually signed the stopgap a short time ago. Let's get you up to date on world and national news before some final thoughts from our panel. Nancy Lyons has that in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. President Biden is making another move to forgive student debt as he ramps up his re-election campaign. Bloomberg's Nathan Hager has more from Washington.
The Biden administration has announced another nearly $5 billion in debt relief, covering nearly 74,000 student borrowers. The move comes a day after nearly 70 groups wrote to Education Secretary Miguel Cardona calling for more targeted relief for low-income borrowers, people of color, and those who've experienced hardship. Polls show President Biden's support has weakened among the Black, Hispanic, and young voters he'll need to secure a second term. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
Republicans running the House Oversight Committee are celebrating the news that Hunter Biden will be sitting for a closed-door deposition late next month. Committee Chair James Comer says the president's son is a key witness in the House Republican impeachment inquiry. Comer telling reporters they're doing their investigation by the book.
You've done this the right way. We are in a position to win in court. If we weren't, he wouldn't be coming in to do this deposition. We have done everything the right way. We've been transparent. We've followed the law.
Congressman James Comer, Hunter Biden had requested his testimony be public, not private, saying he did not want Republicans to cherry-pick his words to fit their narrative. One of his confidants testified this week behind closed doors and accused Comer of taking his words out of context. Japan is now the fifth country to successfully land on the moon. The country's Slim lander touched down on the moon at about 10:20 a.m. Eastern time today. That's according to the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. SLIM stands for Smart Lander for Investigating Moon, and it's part of a cargo research mission. Japan now joins the U.S., China, India, and Russia as countries that have landed on the moon. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
Nancy, thank you. And thanks to Nancy for pointing me to this incredibly important day in history. God, do we feel old? It was 20 years ago. I want to bring you back to Iowa. Remember Nikki Haley finishing third, tried to spin that as a two-person race? Howard Dean came in third in Iowa and got on the stage that night and made it clear. He said, by God, if you told us a year ago we'd come in third, we would have celebrated. Remember? Can we hear him?
I'm harking.
No.
We're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and
Yes.
New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Ah!
20 years since the Dean scream. It's even got its own wiki, Rick and Jeannie. What do you think about this night in infamy, Jeannie? Fast forward to the Trump era. Can you believe that was credited for partly undoing his campaign?
Times have changed so much. You know, when you play that for young people, when you play it for students, they don't even bat an eyelash. That was at a time when those things went viral. They spend all their days on TikTok. This scream is nothing to them now. They can understand why we make such a big deal out of it at this point.
I think the lesson, apparently, Rick, from those who were there is, you know, it was unfair. It was loud and festive in the room, and he was on a directional microphone, so all you could hear was this when it sounded like something wild and powerful in the room. Were you aware of this when you would put John McCain on stage?
Well, John McCain was aware of it. I mean, you know, you didn't have to be too out of the political mainstream to remember the Dean scream. You know, everybody does it. They all got their versions of it. But I would give him credit. He was the very first viral campaign that relied on the internet to organize. And so, you know, inside the business, he'll be seen as that pioneer.
All the way back in 2004. Hey, great conversation, Rick and Jeannie. I'm looking forward to meeting you both in Manchester. Safe travels this weekend. We've got a lot to cover. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Kaylee's on the way in next on Sound On.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself. Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The government will not shut down, at least not today. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On, the final edition of Sound On, live from Washington. As President Biden signs the stopgap plan they just passed in Congress, he just put pen to paper to keep things running. But what happens next is anyone's guess. We're going to explore the options coming up this hour, from crafting a budget to a deal on the border that seems to potentially be on the rocks here. Kaylee Lines is with us now for Hour 2, as always. And Kaylee, there are more Republicans, it seems, in the no border camp than Democrats at this point. This role reversal is wild.
Welcome to trying to legislate in an election year, Joe, where, yes, Democrats are under the political pressure to do something at the border, as is true of President Biden. But because it is a hot-button political issue, perhaps Republicans don't want to give Democrats the win before voters head to the polls in November.
In an election year.
Right.
We're going to talk about this coming up in the sort of contours of trying to craft a budget in this divisive environment, because we've got our new stopgap brings us to March, but then what? Will there be another one? Could we just do CRs the rest of the year? Or will we actually have spending bills? Bharat Ramamurthy, who spent time as an economic advisor to President Biden, will join us now.
Yeah.
As we've said before, he can speak freely now that he's, I don't know, it's amazing what you hear when, a real thoughtful voice on this, though, and I'm curious to hear his thoughts on whether we can craft a budget even, or is Congress just broken?
Well, considering by March, when theoretically they would get this done, when the latest continuing resolution expires on the 1st and the 8th, we will be almost halfway through the fiscal year that this budget is intended to address, and on the cusp of getting President Biden's budget for the next fiscal year. So why not just skip ahead to that?
They're writing the State of the Union now. I mean, it's time to get on with this. Another big headline today, we talked about it with Rick and Jeannie, both of whom were kind of blown away by it. Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, not waiting until the South Carolina contest, but on this eve of New Hampshire, set to endorse Donald Trump. It's going to happen tonight in Concord. They've got a rally set up. Kaylee, this is a huge blow to Nikki Haley, who was praying for that backup from her own state. As I said, the call's coming from inside the House here.
Yeah, not just her own state. She appointed to Tim Scott in the Senate in the first place.
What a way to make a living.
That's a pretty big blow.
Politics, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so we're just getting rolling here on hour 2. I'm real glad you're with us on the radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. Starting on Monday, this is big. We're going to be at an earlier time. Kaylee will be here, don't worry. 12 noon to 2, Washington time. Hour 1 on the radio and YouTube. And Kaylee, we're going to be on Bloomberg Television, which is a great opportunity here to bring politics to the world in an election cycle. We're looking forward to it. So let's get up to date on trading here. Denise Pellegrini has that covered in New York for us. Hi, Denise.
Hey, Joe and Kayla. We've got a rally going on this Friday. Stocks higher on surging consumer sentiment and also waning inflation concerns. We have the S&P 500 hitting a new intraday record high. If it closes there, we will see another record high for the S&P 500. But Ben Emmons, head of fixed income of New Edge Wealth, says he's pretty sure you shouldn't be too worried about the economy taking a big dip from here. Here's why.
Part of this soft landing or strange landing, how you want to call it, is that the economy is not going to recession. The spending levels remain so high and it's invested in the economy.
And Emmons there on the Bloomberg Markets podcast. Right now, the Dow is better by just about 1%, 364 points higher. The S&P 500 holding steady, that new intraday record high up 1.1%, 52 points higher at 48.33 right now. And the NASDAQ up almost 1.5%. Better by 213 points. Spot gold right now up 0.2%, 20.27 an ounce. NYMEX crude down more than 1%, 73.30 a barrel. Spirit Airlines says its deal with JetBlue remains in full force and effect, and it's doing a lot, it says, to shore up its liquidity. Spirit shares are up 23% right now. And Google shares also higher. We are hearing Google DeepMind scientists are in talks to leave and form an AI startup backed by hundreds of millions of dollars, and that would be in Paris. And that, guys, is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Welcome to hour 2 of Sound On this Friday in Washington. It's like a snow globe up here in the Bloomberg Bureau in D.C. It's actually beautiful as long as you don't have to go outside, I guess.
Yeah, it feels very cozy on the inside. And I take some personal solace in knowing that the outside isn't as cold as it was the last time I saw snow, which was in Iowa.
No, it's actually not that cold out, but this is the reason why the government's open, basically.
Right.
They felt the need to get out of town before the snow started. It turned out to be a real snowstorm, so God bless it. The schools are closed, but the government is open. We'll go with that. Did they get that markup going, the Ways and Means? These are like the only people who had to go to work in the Capitol today at 9 a.m. Thank you very much. Richie Neal had his snow boots ready.
And it passed out of the committee. I guess we'll see what the fate is now of this tax deal, because a lot of people were pushing for changes that they didn't necessarily get.
Well, that's true. I suspect that Bharat Ramamurthy has some thoughts on that. An expanded child tax credit was a huge priority for the administration while he was working for Joe Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. And theoretically could be growth positive if it were to come through at what is a pretty critical moment for a Biden administration that is still struggling with getting credit for the strength of the economy that we're still seeing.
That's true. And it would come in exchange for more business-friendly taxes. Everything is a bargain, of course, in Washington. And let's bring in Bharat Ramamurthy now, Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project, of course, former Deputy Director of National Economic Council, as you probably remember seeing and hearing in his days at the White House. Bharat, welcome back. It's good to see you. Is that a fair trade? I was going to start on something else, but while we're talking about this was a big deal. This goes back to Build Back Better. To trade an expanded child tax credit for more business-friendly, more corporate taxes, does that end up being a wash in a way that's good for the country?
I guess I would say this. I think it's a travesty that in the wealthiest planet on Earth, you have millions of children growing up in poverty. And I think any step we take towards reducing the number of children in poverty is a step worth taking. And this deal, as you noted, expands the child tax credit. It will lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. And I think that makes it worthwhile. I think the corporate elements of it are, frankly, a little disappointing and unnecessary. For example, one portion of it is a set of retroactive tax cuts for the 2023 tax year. The entire theory behind these corporate tax cuts is that they're intended to create an incentive for more investment. It's hard to go back in time and create an incentive in 2023 with this change. That's just a pure giveaway. But if it's the price that we have to pay to lift more children out of poverty, I think it's a small price that's worth paying.
I wonder about your thoughts on the order this is being done, though. If we could potentially see a tax deal on the revenue side passed before we actually get a budget for the fiscal year that started months ago on the spending side of the ledger.
Yeah, I think you always see this kind of disjunction between some of the revenue measures moving at a different pace than the spending side. To go to your point about spending, if you all remember when we had the debt ceiling standoff several months ago, the outcome of that was that the president and the House Republicans agreed on a deal where they set a top line for spending in the coming fiscal year. And the only thing that had to happen after that was that House Republicans had to go back and actually write individual spending bills to match that top line. Instead, what's happened is that there's been repeated attempts to renegotiate the deal that was struck to avoid the debt ceiling crisis, and that's what's brought us to this position where you have these repeated continuing resolutions. I think it's unfortunate. I think